A creepy family vacation. The summer between my junior and senior years of high school, I got to bring my best friend, Lindsay, along on a family vacation. I was thrilled to share the trip with her because we planned to stop in Iowa, my old home state, and visit some family friends on the way to Minnesota. I even got to show her one of my favorite places in the world, Ledges State Park. Unfortunately, the trip started rough for Lindsay. She got sick in Ames, and despite our best efforts to help her with medicine and rest, she was miserable. When we reached Minnesota, we stayed at my aunt's apartment, along with my 2 cousins and my grandma. Lindsay had a little crush on my older cousin, and they got along well, so she slept on an air mattress in their room. I was a bit jealous of the attention she was giving him, but I set up my air mattress in the living room. That night, Lindsay woke up with a high fever and came to the living room to wake up my mom. She said she felt uncomfortable in the boys' room, so we moved her air mattress to the living room, and my mom gave her more medicine. The next day, Lindsay told me it wasn't just the fever that had disturbed her sleep. Something else had happened. She said she couldn't stop staring at the night light in my cousin's room, which cycled through colors: white, yellow, green, blue, and red. But while she was watching it, the light started changing to colors that weren't part of the cycle, like purple. Then, her attention was drawn to a box fan near the open closet. She said she heard a growl, and suddenly, the fan was violently knocked over and broke. The growling terrified her, and she insisted on sleeping in the living room after that. This incident reminded me of other strange experiences I'd had at my cousin's previous apartment. I wasn't surprised she heard growling in their room, but I didn't know how to console her. Thankfully, we weren't staying another night there, and she was relieved to leave. The next leg of our trip took us further north, where we camped at Tettigouche State Park and visited Grand Marais, one of my favorite places. During our visit to Split Rock Lighthouse, Lindsay drank some Lake Superior water, and her fever disappeared almost immediately. She felt much better, and the trip seemed to be improving. Midway through the vacation, we moved to Bear Head Lake State Park to camp for a few days. Lindsay and I both found the park unsettling. Although it was full of cars, tents, and campers, it was eerily quiet. It felt unnatural, as if the silence itself was watching us. On our first full day at Bear Head, Lindsay and I decided to explore. The park was beautiful, but there was something off about it. While walking, we found a fish cleaning shack near a bathroom. I needed to use the restroom, so I left Lindsay at the shack while I went inside. The bathroom was basic but had running water and showers. It was empty when I entered. I chose the middle stall, wanting to avoid both the first and handicap stalls. As I settled in, I heard a car pull up outside, followed by footsteps entering the bathroom. Thinking it was another woman, I didn't pay much attention, until the person walked straight up to my stall door without checking the other stalls. Under the door, I saw straight-leg blue jeans and large feet wearing men's running shoes. My heart raced. Whoever it was just stood there, facing my stall door. They didn't knock or say anything. They just stood there for what felt like an eternity. I felt trapped and vulnerable, unsure of what to do. Finally, the person turned and left. I didn't hear a car start or see anyone nearby when I hurried out. Shaken, I went back to Lindsay and asked if she'd seen anyone go into the bathroom. She hadn't. She said she'd seen a car pass by earlier, but no one had stopped. I told her what happened, and we decided to avoid that bathroom for the rest of our stay. On our last day at Bear Head, we got the wild idea to use the showers in that same bathroom. We figured it would be fine since there were 2 of us. Armed with our shower supplies, we headed back. Again, the bathroom was empty. The shower floors were wet, evidence that someone had used them earlier, and there was a pink bottle of Suave shampoo left in the corner of one of the stalls. We joked around as we each took a shower stall, trying to make light of the creepy atmosphere. As we started shampooing our hair, we heard a loud thump. It sounded like it came from the entrance door. I called out to ask if anyone was there, feeling braver with Lindsay nearby. We both peeked out of our stalls, but the bathroom was empty. The stall doors were open, and no one was at the sinks or mirrors. Trying to laugh it off, we joked about sharing a stall to feel safer. That's when we heard another loud noise, a sharp, plastic slap against the floor. I looked out and saw that the Suave bottle had been thrown out of the shower stall and onto the cement floor. Its cap popped open and pink conditioner splattered everywhere. At that point, I joined Lindsay in her stall. We took turns showering, keeping watch for any other strange happenings. Nothing else happened, but we finished as quickly as possible and left the bathroom, vowing never to return. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. There are only 2 supernatural experiences in my life that truly stand out. I shared the first one in a previous story, and now I'd like to share the second. Unlike the first, this one isn't happy. It's not as intense as some of the stories I've read, but for our family, it was terrifying. This happened in 2011 when I only had 2 children. My youngest was 2 years old, and my oldest, who was most affected, was 6. I was also pregnant with my 3rd child. We had just moved into a small farmhouse on 5 acres of land. The property included a barn, chicken coop, and several outbuildings. The house itself was built in the 1950s, but the land was part of a subdivision from a larger farm that had belonged to the same family for generations. The story we were told was that the land was split because of a serious falling out between 2 brothers. Despite its history, I loved the farm. I threw myself into caring for baby goats and hatching chickens. But there was one part of the property I didn't like, a makeshift storage room in the back of the garage. It wasn't just the room itself that bothered me. It was the trapdoor in its floor. Beneath the trapdoor was a small room dug into the earth. My husband said it was probably just an old root cellar, but the thought of going down there made me feel physically ill. Even the dogs seemed uneasy around that part of the garage, though I figured they were picking up on my discomfort. A few months after we moved in, my 6-year-old started talking about pictures in his head. He knew what dreams were, but he insisted these weren't dreams. They seemed to bother him most at night, but he described them as vivid, waking images. At first, I didn't think much of it. He had a wonderful imagination. But the pictures became increasingly violent and disturbing. He started describing horrific scenes. Beaten and broken women impaled on spikes, and people being graphically torn apart and fed to monstrous beasts. These weren't images a 6-year-old could have picked up from anywhere. They were far beyond anything he had ever been exposed to. Things escalated quickly. He became scared all the time, unable to find relief. I spent countless nights rocking him as he cried, praying over him until he fell asleep. I would sleep on the floor next to his bed, holding his hand, trying to keep him calm. Felt like we were losing our minds. In desperation, I confided in an older friend from church. I thought she'd think I was crazy, but instead, she calmly said, "Well, looks like we better get a prayer team out there ASAP." A few days later, she arrived with a group of people from church, mostly older members. They weren't flashy or dramatic, just kind and serious. They walked the entire property, praying and anointing various spots with oil they'd brought. They didn't want my son to feel singled out, so they included him in the walk and later prayed over him and the rest of our family individually. 2 areas in the house stood out to my friend. The first was the root cellar in the garage, the one that had always made me uneasy. The second was a large closet in my husband's basement office, directly beneath my son's bedroom. In that closet, they found another hole covered by a board. It was about the size of an old well, about 5 feet deep, with an inch or 2 of water at the bottom. To this day, my friend won't tell me what she saw in those spots. I haven't pressed her for details because I'm not sure I want to know. After the prayer team left, they gave us instructions to reinforce their work. I wrote a prayer over every window and door in the house, as well as at every entrance to the property. My husband walked the perimeter of the property, praying and driving in blessed stakes at intervals. The results were almost immediate. Less than 24 hours later, my son seemed calmer. By 48 hours, the violent pictures in his head were gone. Within a week, he seemed to have no recollection of them at all. To this day, he doesn't remember any of it. I often wonder about the source of whatever plagued our family. Was it tied to the house or the land? Both of the most intense areas, the root cellar and the hole in the basement closet, were places where the earth had been disturbed. Could something have been buried or connected to those spots? Whatever it was, I'm grateful it's gone. The experience taught me that faith and community can make a difference, even in the face of the unexplainable. As I said before, my friend had been dealing with a lot of negative energies, and I truly believe that whatever was in my room that night followed me home. Maybe it was the same entity tormenting him, or perhaps it was something else, testing me to see if I would let it in. Of all the paranormal experiences I've had, this is probably the scariest purely because of how evil that presence felt. It's something I'll never forget. I'm so grateful to be part of a community where people can share their experiences like this. I've always thought the paranormal and ghosts were just Hollywood nonsense, something made up for TV shows and movies. That was until I started working part-time at a local daycare run by a family friend. For privacy reasons, I'll leave the name of the daycare out. The first day I started working was a lot of fun. I love kids and enjoy spending time with them, so it was a perfect fit. But there was something odd about one of the children, a 4-year-old named and not her real name. She kept talking about someone called Big Bro. I thought it was just an imaginary friend, but when I asked her parents about it, they told me she was an only child. I shrugged it off and forgot about it, thinking it was just part of her imagination. But things started to feel a little strange, and the first real paranormal event happened in November. The daycare had the heat running constantly because it was cold outside, yet whenever I'd walk into the playroom, it felt freezing. I checked the vent to see if it was covered, but there was heat coming from it. I also checked the window and it was tightly shut. I couldn't figure out why the room was so cold. But a few hours later, when I went back in to clean up the toys, the room was warm, just like the others. A few days later, something even stranger happened. I was checking on the babies during nap time. Some of them are little escape artists, and when I opened the door to one of the rooms, I saw Bobby, not his real name, halfway over the side of his crib. When I caught sight of him, he froze for a second, clearly scared, and let go of the crib rail. The distance from his crib to the door was about 14 feet. I rushed toward him, but the freakiest part was that he stopped in midair, hovering for a moment, before being gently lowered onto the floor. I was frozen in disbelief but quickly grabbed him and ran out of the room. I went straight to Emily, not her real name, the daycare owner, and told her what had happened. She looked at me like it was no big deal and said, "Relax, dear. That's just Chris." I was dumbfounded. She explained that Chris had worked at the daycare for years, making the kids happy, but had passed away a few months before I started working there due to an asthma attack. Emily said the kids still called him Big Bro, and because they were so young and innocent they could see him. Chris continued to help out, even after passing away. She told me that sometimes she'd still see him playing with the kids. Babies giggling uncontrollably when they were alone, blocks moving by themselves, and the rocking chair where he used to read to them rocking on its own. After our conversation, I started noticing similar things. One day, I was trying to comfort a fussy baby when I tripped over a toy and fell backward. I instinctively wrapped the baby up and braced for the pain, but I never hit the ground. Instead, I felt myself being gently pushed back up. I heard whistling, like a lullaby, and suddenly the baby calmed down. The kids still talk about seeing Big Bro, and sometimes I walk into the playroom to find that all the toys are already put away, even though I didn't see anyone doing it. Looking back, I feel fortunate that my first encounter with the paranormal has been so positive. Rather than feeling scared or unsettled, I found it comforting to think that Chris is still watching over the kids and helping out when he can. I've never been one to shy away from telling people about my paranormal experiences. It runs in my family, even though some of us wish it didn't. I wasn't sure where to start, but I'll share this one from my time at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. Last year, in April 2017, after a grueling semester of graduate school, I decided to take a week off work and spend it in northeast Minnesota along the shores of Lake Superior. The first half of my vacation was in Duluth and Two Harbors, where I spent my days hiking, mountain biking, and relaxing. For the second half, I drove up the shore to Grand Marais, a small town about 2 hours north of Duluth. As I settled into my hotel room in Grand Marais, I decided to look up haunted places in the area. Earlier that week, I had toured the Glensheen Mansion in Duluth, where the guide mentioned rumors of a ghost said to haunt the hallways after a tragic murder there. It piqued my curiosity, and I wondered if there were any similar places nearby. A quick search led me to Maple Hill Cemetery, mentioned on a few haunted places websites. Most stories reference sightings of a man holding a lantern. The websites were outdated, but the reports were recent enough to intrigue me. The next morning, I plugged the location into my GPS and drove out to see it for myself. Maple Hill Cemetery is about 2 to 3 miles up the Gunflint Trail from Grand Marais. You reach it by turning off onto a dirt and gravel road surrounded by tall trees. As you drive further in, the road feels increasingly remote, passing a few scattered houses tucked into the forest. Eventually, you reach what seems like a dead end before the road abruptly turns left, leading another 500 feet to the cemetery. The cemetery itself is a mix of new and old gravestones, spread across a slightly sloping hill and surrounded by thick pine trees. In the center stands an old wooden church, and the road through the cemetery forms a three-way intersection, with one path leading west to a small parking area. When I arrived, it was a cloudy day, and while the snow near Lake Superior had mostly melted, there were still patches of it lingering in the woods around the cemetery. A light fog hovered over the western half of the cemetery, drifting out from the tree line. The air felt unusually heavy, almost oppressive, as I got out of my car and began exploring. The cemetery was eerily quiet, and as I wandered around taking photos, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About 10 minutes in, I stood near the entrance to the old church and quietly asked, "Is anyone here?" Within a minute, I felt a distinct sensation, like 2 fingers brushing the back of my head. Startled, I spun around, but there was no one there. I asked again, louder this time, but received no response. Feeling uneasy, I decided to head back toward the cemetery entrance. As I walked, the air around me suddenly turned icy cold, dropping what felt like 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. The day had been chilly, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but this was different, far more intense. Then, a paralyzing fear washed over me. I wasn't physically frozen, but I was terrified to move. It felt as though if I so much as took a step, something terrible would happen. My mind became clouded, and the sense of being watched intensified, growing unbearable. I stood there, rooted to the spot, until I whispered, "Let me go!" Almost immediately, the oppressive feeling lifted. My mind cleared, the cold dissipated, and I could move again. Shaken, I made a beeline for my car, determined to leave. As I reached my car, something caught my eye. A translucent, gray mist-like figure darting between the trees along the western edge of the cemetery. At first, I thought it was the fog, but then I saw it weaving left and right through the trees, moving deliberately along the cemetery's border. It was about 6 feet tall and seemed to glide along the ground. After a few moments, it turned sharply and vanished into the woods. Even as I drove away, I felt like something was watching me. The sensation didn't fade until I turned back onto the Gunflint Trail, and even then, I couldn't shake the urge to get as far away as possible. I floored it back to Grand Marais, my mind racing. Even a year later, I can't fully explain what happened that day. The sensation of paralysis and the clouded mind made me wonder if it could have been a brief attempt at possession. But the rest of the experience remains a mystery. Whatever was in Maple Hill Cemetery, it made sure I wouldn't forget it. I'm 20 years old, currently in college, and I've lived in Minnesota my whole life. Interestingly, many of my paranormal experiences involve my grandparents, on both sides of the family. For this story, I'll focus on my maternal grandparents, who have lived in Florida for most of my life. My mom, brother, and I visited them every other year or they'd visit us. Aside from letters and phone calls, that was the extent of our contact. Despite the distance, our time together was always meaningful. It's worth mentioning that my maternal grandfather and his mother seemed particularly open to the paranormal. They both had a history of attracting unusual energy, or so I was told by my mom and grandpa. I'll share one of his stories another time, but this experience begins in March 2016, during my freshman year of college. At the time, I was struggling with school and hadn't been in touch with my grandparents for a while, which wasn't unusual given my busy schedule. Then one night, I had a strange dream. In it, I was a child again, playing at an old neighborhood park. My grandma was wandering aimlessly, clearly distressed, as if she were trying to tell me something urgent. I woke up feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off. A few nights later, I had another dream about her, but this one was even more unsettling. In the dream, she was a ghost. She led me into the garage of my childhood home, crying as she said, "There's so much I wanted to tell you." I woke up worried and asked my mom if everything was okay with my grandparents. She reassured me that everything was fine. Not even a week later, my grandpa had a stroke and fell, landing him in the hospital. My mom flew to Florida to help my grandma care for him during his recovery. She spent most of March there, dealing with the stress of hospitals and the uncertainty of his condition. By April, it became clear that my grandpa wasn't going to recover. My brother and I flew to Florida to say our goodbyes. I was very close to my grandpa. He always had a story to share and could make me laugh like no one else, so it was devastating to see him so weak in hospice care. After a few days, my brother and I had to return to Minnesota for school. My grandpa hadn't passed yet, but we'd said our goodbyes. The night after we returned home, I had a vivid and deeply emotional dream. In it, I walked up a set of wooden steps to a door at the top. The door opened into a hallway filled with bright, white light. My grandpa stepped out of the doorway. He looked healthy, wearing his signature neon green tank top and shorts, the outfit he always wore during visits. He hugged me tightly, and I could actually feel his embrace. It wasn't like a normal dream where things feel hazy or intangible. It felt real. As he hugged me, he communicated a deep sense of peace. I also heard his voice in my mind, saying that he loved me and everything would be okay. After he let go, I watched him walk down the hallway. That's where the dream ended, but I didn't wake up immediately. I stayed in a state of deep, calm trance until morning. When I woke up, I felt at peace, unlike anything I'd ever experienced after a dream. Later that day, my mom told me that my grandpa had passed. I'm not sure if it happened at the exact moment of my dream, but it felt too significant to be a coincidence. I can't help but wonder if that dream was my grandpa's spirit saying goodbye to me. The way I felt during and after the dream was unlike anything I'd experienced before. The hug, especially, felt so tangible and real. It wasn't like a typical dream at all. I truly believe he visited me to give me closure. I'm also curious about the dreams I had about my grandma before this stressful time began. Were those dreams connected to the events that followed? And if so, why was my grandma crying in them while my grandpa was absent? It feels like there's a deeper meaning I can't quite grasp. Interestingly, my grandpa once had a physical visitation from a deceased loved one near the time of their death, a story I'll share later. I wonder if this kind of connection runs in our family, or if I'm just reading too much into it. Either way, the experience has stayed with me and left me with more questions than answers. My name is Camille. I'm 13, almost 14, and I live in Iron, Minnesota. This is the story of how I became connected to something or someone completely unexpected. A couple of years ago, I was obsessed with online games, especially Movie Star Planet. It consumed most of my summer, and I spent hours exploring its forums, where users could rant or chat. One topic seemed to pop up everywhere. How do you feel about my friend Dahmer? At first, I thought it was just another fleeting internet trend, but my curiosity eventually got the better of me. Without even knowing what it was about, I had a strange, intuitive feeling. Dahmer was someone's high school friend who had become a terrible person in real life. Oddly, I imagined him as a blonde-haired man with blue eyes, though I had never heard of Jeffrey Dahmer in my life. I told myself I'd look it up later but forgot about it. A year passed, and out of nowhere, the thought of my friend Dahmer popped into my head again. It felt almost like the idea was pushed into my mind. Curious, I searched for it on YouTube and found movie trailers. The trailers portrayed a dark, gritty coming-of-age story set in the 1970s. I was shocked to see Ross Lynch, a former Disney star, playing the lead role, but what really struck me was the revelation that the movie was based on true events. At the end of the trailer, I saw the name Jeffrey Dahmer for the first time, and I immediately Googled him. When I read Jeffrey Dahmer, American serial killer and sex offender, I felt an intense wave of dread. I clicked on the images and the feeling worsened. Yet there was also a strange, inexplicable familiarity. His face felt familiar, as if I'd known him before. It was unsettling, like my soul recognized him even though I didn't. Part of me felt repelled, but another part felt connected, almost comforted, like I'd found someone I'd been missing. I began researching him obsessively, trying to make sense of the connection. The more I learned, the more I felt I understood him. I didn't see him as just a serial killer. Yes, he did horrible, unforgivable things, but I didn't believe he was evil. He was deeply lonely and consumed by his dark fantasies. But he didn't kill out of joy or malice. He was a sad, broken person who cared but couldn't control his compulsions. I didn't condone what he did, but I felt an unusual empathy for him. People even told me I seemed to understand him better than most, which both comforted and unsettled me. Around this time, strange things began happening. I noticed cold spots in my room and random breezes of freezing air, even though my basement bedroom had no open windows. Once, while writing on my laptop, I felt someone stroke my cheek. My hair was tied back, so it couldn't have been that. These incidents felt small but undeniable. One night, I had a vivid dream. Everything was white and glowing, and Jeffrey Dahmer was there. He seemed upset about something, though I couldn't remember what he said. I told my mom about the dream, leaving out his name, and she suggested it might have been heaven. I wasn't sure what to believe, but it stuck with me. Curiosity led me to download a spirit box app. When I asked who I was speaking to, it replied, "Jeff." This startled me but also felt validating. I began seeing orbs around my room. My best friend even pointed them out before I mentioned anything to her. Then came the light incident. I had Christmas lights hanging in my room, but they'd fallen and blocked my door. Too short to fix them, I left them in a heap. One day, after angrily cursing about them, I returned home to find the lights neatly tucked back into place. My door, which I'd left open, was closed. I felt an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude, as though someone unseen had done this just for me. At this point, I began to suspect that Jeffrey Dahmer's spirit was with me. Using a Ouija board, I asked if it was him, and it responded yes. He answered several questions that left me convinced. The Spirit Box app even echoed phrases I'd read Dahmer used, like folks and baloney. One night, I felt overwhelmed by doubt. Crying, I asked for a sign that I wasn't crazy. That night, I had another dream. I was in a fuzzy, white place with two bouquets of roses. One was an ugly peach color, and the other was a stunning deep red. I kept thinking, I need to get Jeff red roses. Suddenly, the scene shifted, and I stood before Jeffrey Dahmer. He was glowing, alive, and radiant, and he looked at me with pure happiness. I handed him the red roses, and we shared a deep, mutual understanding, an unspoken feeling of peace and love. Then, everything faded to black, and I woke up. My dried roses by my bed, long dead, smelled fresh and fragrant. This experience left me deeply confused. I feel a strong connection to Jeffrey Dahmer, something I struggle to reconcile. I don't idolize or excuse him, but I believe his spirit is with me. The dreams, the signs, and the overwhelming emotions make me think there's more to this connection than I understand. I'm not sure if this is a family theme, as I've had relatives experience spirit visits before, but I can't shake the feeling that this bond is significant. I'd love to hear thoughts on what this could mean and why I feel this connection so strongly. In a scenic Minnesota city near where I went to college, there's a theater with a reputation for being haunted by a mischievous ghost known as the Blue Man. He's famous for moving props, tampering with curtains, and turning stage lights on and off, sometimes in the middle of performances. Stage managers often reported technical issues in the booth that would mysteriously fix themselves, while actors spoke of strange feelings or fleeting shadows backstage. Some even claimed to have seen him. A man in blue coveralls with shaggy light hair and 70s-style glasses. The theater, a attached to an old train depot, made many believe the ghost might have been a worker or engineer, though that's never been confirmed. As an actor and a believer in the paranormal, I was fascinated by the stories of the Blue Man. While he was known to disrupt productions, no one ever described him as malevolent, just mischievous. I had the chance to work at that theater twice, both times in musicals, and during my first show I had my own encounter. The theater itself is a proscenium stage with fly space and wings, surrounded by a few hundred seats arranged in a semicircle. The lighting booth is centered in the back of the house, and the audience enters from a lobby through double doors that lead to side aisles. One important detail: during rehearsals, only the stage right door to the house is unlocked. The stage left door remains bolted shut, and the booth is accessible only through stage right. One night during rehearsal, I was the last actor left working with the director and assistant director, AD. Everyone else had gone, either through the back loading dock or the stage right door to the lobby. We'd been working for about 45 minutes, the three of us alone in the building. I was standing on stage near the edge, while the director and AD were on the floor in the audience, leaning over a script spread across the stage. As they talked, I suddenly felt an intense sensation of being watched. I glanced up and froze. In the very back row, far left corner, I saw him. A man with shaggy light hair, 70s style glasses, and what looked like a gray button-down shirt. I could only see him from the chest up, as if he were sitting or standing behind the seat. Startled, I did a double take. At first, I thought it might be a janitor or the parent of one of the younger cast members. I looked back at the script but couldn't shake the feeling. When I glanced up again, we made eye contact. He was staring right at me. I smiled nervously and gave a small wave. He didn't respond, just kept looking at me. I looked back down, thinking, wait, no one else is here, and immediately glanced back up. He was gone. A chill ran through me as I stared at the spot where he'd been. I couldn't understand how he could have disappeared so quickly. There was no sound of a door opening or closing, and no way to leave without walking through the back row, which I would have seen. Shaken, I asked the director and AD if everyone else had left earlier. They confirmed we were alone and mentioned that the janitor had locked the front doors nearly an hour ago. When we finished, I watched the AD check both doors in the house. The stage left door was locked, as always, and the stage right door was also locked. We turned off the lights and left through the back loading dock. When I got to my car, my heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a janitor I didn't recognize? But if it was, I would have seen or heard him leave. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd seen the Blue Man. The next night, I arrived early for rehearsal. The ghost light was still on, and the stage was empty. Standing at center stage, I decided to acknowledge him. "Hello," I said, introducing myself and my role. "Thank you for coming to rehearsal last night. It's nice to meet you. We're really excited about the show, but I'm nervous about the flying harnesses and cables. Would you mind keeping an eye on us and keeping us safe?" I paused, feeling the weight of the silence. Then I added, "Thank you for sharing the space with us." After that, I didn't see him again during rehearsals or performances. Paranormally speaking, things were quiet. In fact, others commented on how smoothly everything was going. Props stayed put, lights worked flawlessly, and there were no unexplained incidents. At the cast party, the stage manager mentioned that this was the first show she'd worked on where the Blue Man hadn't caused trouble. When I told her about my encounter, she smiled and said, "Well, it sounds like you made a friend." I didn't know if that was true, but I was relieved the show went off without a hitch. Then came the next musical. During the first big company number, the stage lights suddenly went out. The cast and musicians kept going, and a minute later, the lights snapped back on. At intermission, I found the stage manager and asked what happened. She laughed and said, "I guess he's back at it." Oh. This happened to me last night around 3 a.m., and it's by far the most frightening experience I've ever had. It all started with a seemingly normal dream. In the dream, it was a dark and rainy afternoon, and I was wandering through a small city, exploring its buildings. At some point, I found myself walking down a sidewalk, where I stumbled upon a strange scene involving Mulder and Scully, the iconic characters from the X-Files. Oddly enough, I hadn't watched the show in years, so it was strange to see them in my dream. Mulder was lying on his side in a fetal position, as though he had been injured, and Scully was resting her head on his body, listening for a heartbeat. Suddenly, I was in Mulder's position, he was gone, and I had taken his place, lying on the sidewalk with Scully leaning on me. As I lay there in the fetal position, I became hyper-aware of my heart. I could hear it beating loudly but very slowly, and my breathing was also slowing. That's when I realized I was dying. In those moments, I began to accept my death, trying to come to terms with it. I wasn't afraid, just calm, almost detached. But as I took what I thought would be my last breath, the feeling of dying reached an overwhelming climax. Fear overtook me. I realized I didn't want to die, and my body responded with an intense buzzing, tingling sensation, like waves moving from my lower back to my head. It felt as though my body was trying to paralyze itself. In sheer panic, I jerked myself awake. When I woke up, I was on my futon in the exact same fetal position from the dream, my covers pulled over my entire body, including my head. My heart was racing, and I was breathing quickly now. I was fully awake and completely aware of my surroundings. Through the lightweight, semi-transparent blanket, the room appeared unusually bright, as though it were early morning. Curious, I reached up to pull the covers down slightly and peek out. That's when I saw it. Just inches from my face was a glowing figure, a whitish-blue face with distinct features, including a defined eye socket, nose, and mouth. The face was turned slightly away from me, but I had the eerie feeling it was about to turn and look directly at me. It didn't, but the overwhelming sense of presence it exuded was undeniable. I stared at it for what felt like a few seconds before panicking and pulling the covers back over my head. The fear was immediate and visceral. Even though I couldn't see it anymore, I could still feel its presence. It didn't feel like something tied to the room, it felt like it was there specifically for me. I lay under the covers, sweating and struggling to breathe, but I was too terrified to uncover my face. Eventually, I turned onto my right side, still hiding under the blankets. My phone was under the covers with me, so I checked the time, 3:20 a.m. I stayed there for what felt like forever, feeling the entity's presence slowly fade. When I finally felt brave enough to peek out, the room was dark again, illuminated only by faint lights from the small computer buttons in the far corner. My eyes had adjusted, and I could make out the shapes of my desk and dresser. There was no sign of the glowing face or the mysterious light it had cast. I couldn't explain what I had seen or felt. There were no significant light sources in the room that could account for the brightness, and the corner where I saw the face was nowhere near the faint lights of my computer. I wasn't dreaming or experiencing sleep paralysis. I was fully awake, able to move, and conscious of my surroundings. After some time, I went to the restroom, and although I was still on edge, the entity's presence seemed to be gone when I returned. When I told my mom about the experience, she suggested that my dream about dying might have opened some sort of veil to the spirit world. She thought that my heightened state of mind and proximity to thoughts of death might have made me more vulnerable or receptive to a spirit encounter. Even now, I have no logical explanation for what happened. I've had sleep paralysis before, but this was entirely different. The vividness of the dream, the glowing face, and the overwhelming presence all felt undeniably real. I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm left wondering what it was and why it appeared to me. In May of this year, my wife and I went on a road trip that included a stop in Natchez, Mississippi. We stayed at a former plantation house called Monmouth Plantation. After checking in, an enthusiastic and engaging bellman showed us to our room. When we asked for dinner recommendations, he suggested the dining room in the main house, where we already had reservations for the following night, a must-visit if you ever go. For that evening, he recommended the King's Tavern, a historic spot just a mile or so away. We arrived at the King's Tavern around 6 o'clock to find it nearly empty. The dining room was dimly lit, with stone walls that added to the somber, almost eerie atmosphere. We were seated and handed menus along with a printout detailing the building's history and a photocopied newspaper article. The printout explained that the tavern was haunted by a ghost named Madeline. I've forgotten some of the details, but it mentioned that guests were welcome to visit her bedroom on the third floor. The newspaper article described how, during a previous diner's visit, a heavy iron chain hanging on the wall began to swing back and forth inexplicably. There was even a photo of the chain, which, to my surprise, was right there on the wall beside our table. As dinner progressed, I playfully tried to spook my wife, asking Madeline to make an appearance or move the chain. But nothing happened. During dessert and coffee, I asked my wife if she wanted to go upstairs with me to check out Madeline's room. She declined, so I went alone. The third floor had an old, slightly musty charm, and I found the infamous bed that was said to sometimes feel warm, as if someone had just gotten out of it. I touched it, nothing. I called out for Madeline, inviting her to appear, but again, nothing happened. Feeling slightly let down, I went back downstairs and told my wife she hadn't missed anything. Then I took a sip of my coffee. To my surprise, it tasted and smelled distinctly like perfume. I'd had some before going upstairs, and it was perfectly fine then. I asked my wife if she was messing with me, but she assured me she wasn't. She never wears perfume because of my allergies, and our waitress hadn't returned to the table. Puzzled, I told the hostess what had happened. She just smiled and said, "Madeline likes you." Later that night, back at Monmouth Plantation, we went to bed. A few hours into the night, I woke up suddenly and immediately realized I couldn't move. Sleep paralysis is something I've experienced before, but this was different. To my right, I saw a white apparition standing, or floating, beside me. It was faint and translucent. I could see the painting on the wall through it. While I couldn't make out its facial features clearly, it was unmistakably a female form. Oddly, I didn't feel scared or threatened. I just watched as the figure lingered there, serene and unmoving. I don't know how long it stayed, maybe a minute, maybe 10, but eventually, it faded away. Once it was gone, I fell back asleep and slept peacefully for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my wife what had happened. She just smirked and said, "Well, you did ask her to make an appearance." This experience unfolded over several months, and I've been trying to make sense of it. I'm aware of what an incubus is and have read accounts from people who've had similar encounters. After reflecting on their stories, I found unsettling similarities with my own experiences, which led me to believe that I may have encountered, or may soon encounter, an incubus. I'm 18 years old and recently moved out of my family home. I've been adjusting to living alone, though I'm not sure if that has any connection to what's been happening. I've had sex dreams in the past, but these recent ones have been entirely different, far more vivid and intense. In these dreams, I engage in sexual encounters with a very handsome man who doesn't resemble anyone I know or have seen before. What's unnerving is how real these dreams feel. The sensations are so vivid that I often question whether I'm dreaming at all. Some might dismiss these as wet dreams, but I'm convinced they're not. I've woken up feeling physical pressure around my inner thighs, as if I had actually had sex in real life. I'm not a virgin, so I know what that physical sensation feels like. These dreams have recurred several times over the past month, and I often wake up feeling exhausted or fatigued afterward. The man in the dreams is always the same, which adds to the strangeness. Things took a bizarre turn the other night. As I was lying in bed, my room felt unusually warm, so I decided to sleep in just a shirt and panties. The heat became so uncomfortable that I ended up lying on my back with my legs slightly spread, trying to cool down. I fell asleep, and as usual I dreamed of the same man. But this time it was different. I woke up, or at least I think I woke up. It's hard to tell because it felt like I was in a state between sleeping and waking. I became acutely aware of a presence with me. It felt as if someone, or something, was on top of me, stimulating me, caressing me, and penetrating me. What was most shocking was the sensation of being lifted off the bed, almost as if I was floating in midair. Despite the sheer oddity of the experience, I wasn't scared. In fact, I felt a strange desire for it to continue. The encounter felt surreal yet overwhelmingly real. Afterward, I drifted back into sleep. The next morning, I woke up confused. I couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened was real. To my shock, I discovered a whitish-clear fluid in my underwear with a very pungent smell. I was horrified and began questioning whether it could have been semen. I realized how crazy that sounds, but it was there, and it deepened my conviction that the experience actually happened. Despite everything, I didn't feel frightened or violated, just calm, relaxed, and oddly at peace. What puzzles me is that my dog, who sleeps with me and is extremely protective, didn't react. If there had been some entity in the room, surely she would have growled, barked, or done something. I've read that entities often fear dogs, which makes me question whether it could have been an incubus. However, it's also possible that dogs might not sense incubuses the same way they sense ghosts. I've had experiences with my dog reacting to spiritual presences before. For example, when I once visited a graveyard with her, she barked ferociously at one specific headstone. Her fur stood on end, and she refused to approach the grave. It was clear she sensed something there. But with this recent experience, she didn't react at all. Could it be that dogs can't perceive incubuses? Or is there another explanation? I'm still trying to piece this together. The vividness of the dreams, the physical sensations, and the unexplained evidence all make it hard to dismiss as imagination. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I felt compelled to write this tonight on Halloween. This is a collection of strange occurrences at a house I grew up in. Since this happened so long ago, some of the details may be a little left out, but I will try to keep everything together. The house where these events happened was our first real house. My mom, sister, and I moved out to Mississippi in 1979 with my stepfather. He and my mom got married the following year in June. When I was a young child of maybe 8 or 9, my parents would say that I would sleepwalk. My stepfather, who I called Daddy, would be the one to put me back in bed. They would say that my eyes would be open and rolled back in my head, and I was making weird noises with my arms flailing around. I don't remember this, of course. What I do remember, though, are the numerous nosebleeds I had. I don't know why I mentioned them, but maybe they're relevant to what happened to me. One time, I could see and hear my mattress breathing. I actually saw it rise and fall. I ran out of my room so fast to tell whoever was awake what had happened, but of course it was brushed aside. Another time, when my grandparents came to visit, I had a fright when I saw a girl with dark pigtails dangling them through the air vent in my bedroom ceiling. I felt like she was trying to scare me and told this to my grandmother. She agreed with me, and we recited the Lord's Prayer together. She told me that if I saw her again, I should say the prayer until I wasn't scared anymore. I never saw her again, at least not that I can remember. The final fright had me moving my bedroom to my sister's room. I saw glowing, sharp fingers with long fingernails come out of the closet and wrap around the door. That was it. I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I slept in my sister's bedroom for a while, but soon had to move out of there too because of mosquitoes. They lived in the bushes in front of the house, and I liked to sleep with the windows open. I'll also add that my nosebleeds stopped after I moved out of my original bedroom. I had what I think was a dream, but I was aware of what I was doing. I dreamed that I was outside my house, at the front door with the screen door handle in my hand, like I was going inside. I was staring at this huge orange ball of light that I thought was the sun, but the sun was already up. As I looked at it, I realized it wasn't the sun, because my eyes weren't hurting. I suddenly remembered that my family doesn't use the front door because of the mosquitoes, and I felt put out because I was left at the front door of my own home. The orange ball disappeared when I looked back up, and I laughed at myself. I then went around to the back door and let myself in. I kind of told my mom about it, but she didn't really respond. We never talked about it again. The doorbell would ring by itself at odd hours, day or night. My stepfather, who was handy with electrical work, checked the wiring, but everything seemed fine. No shorts. When my stepfather and I were making a garden, we found a couple of arrowheads. One was made of stone, and the other was made of flint. I wish I still had them. The house was located near an unknown creek in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. There was a cemetery across the main road, Country Club Road, and behind that was a railroad track that's still in use today. My parents sold the house after I graduated high school and moved to the country, where they built a huge house on 40 acres. My toys that needed batteries would suddenly come on and start moving around on their own, even though they had no batteries in them. I also had crises until I was 13. I have a variant of sickle cell disease, and I'm slightly asthmatic due to frequent bouts of pneumonia. I now live at a really high elevation, and I don't have as many breathing problems, just a lot of anxiety. But who doesn't have anxiety these days? My grandfather passed away in 1988. I think it was 3 days after his death when I had a dream about him. I dreamed that he was in the kitchen, leaning over the sink, looking out the window that faced the Baptist church next door. It was frightening to see him there, knowing he was dead and leaning over the sink. You don't normally lean over the sink to look out at the church. He had this look on his face like, "Why are you staring at me like that?" I was terrified and tried to creep past him, and I think that was the end of the dream. Later, relatives reassured me that it was his way of saying goodbye, in a strange way. My grandfather and I were very close, and he always called me his little shadow. I still haven't had any visitation dreams of my aunt who passed in 1986. When I turned 11, I started to experience changes as I entered womanhood. I began having bizarre dreams about not being able to cross the street, like my legs wouldn't work. I also dreamed of a man whose face I could only see from the upper lip to his chin. He kissed me and told me, "Don't forget the premise." This dream haunted me until 1998, when I went numb from the waist down after being treated for a severe kidney infection. My legs still hurt, though I can walk and drive. A couple of months earlier, I went deaf in my left ear. The auditory nerve died, and it's not coming back. My leg pain is constant, and neurologists haven't been able to figure out why my legs hurt the way they do, or why they tingle from my butt down to my ankles. My toes are still curled a bit, and shoes don't fit the same. I don't have good balance. It's frustrating because I love to roller skate. When I was relearning how to walk, I wore Doc Martens. I did it on my own, never went to the hospital. I don't run, and when I do, it feels awkward. I was living on my own by this time, and I was dating a man named Sam. His name has been changed. He adamantly denies being the premise guy, but deep down, I think he knows he is. 10 years later, we're back in contact with each other, and I still have deep feelings for him. I was also dating a man named Rich, also a changed name, who lived near some train tracks in Renton, Washington. I would hear the train coming, and it reminded me of my childhood home. It was comforting in a way, being somewhere new by myself. I told Rich about it, and he thought it was cool. He was my best friend. One night, we went to bed, and I had a dream about my grandmother. She had passed soon after my grandfather in 1990. In the dream, my boyfriend was with me, and my grandmother was looking at him like, "Who are you and what are you doing in my house?" I often visit my grandparents' house in my dreams if I feel insecure. In this dream, she dropped 3 dimes and was trying to pick them up but couldn't quite manage. I offered to help, and that was the end of the dream. I've had many dreams about things before they happened. For example, I dreamed of 9/11. In my dream, the towers were burning, and there was chaos. It didn't make sense at the time, and I kept the dream to myself. When 9/11 happened, I was floored. My grandfather, who was an architectural engineer, had the plans for the Twin Towers on his drafting desk. I remembered him talking about the building of the towers and how a state-of-the-art sprinkler system had been installed to cool down the steel infrastructure. I remember sitting on his lap when I was little, listening to him talk about all the designs he worked on. All I could think of when I saw the destruction on TV was, I hope everyone gets out. Sadly, not everyone did. Well, that's my story. I hope I haven't freaked anyone out. I don't have premise or burning tower dreams anymore. Nor do I dream about my decreased mobility. I think it's because these events have transpired. I've always believed in the supernatural. Just because I had never seen anything myself doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The experience I had happened a while ago, but it's something I'll always remember. It was the summer of 2002. At the time, I was a single mother with 2 boys. We lived in an old apartment complex just a block away from the beach. The complex was small, made up of 6 two-story buildings with about 50 apartments in total. My apartment was on the second floor, at the very end of the building. To reach my apartment, you had to walk up the stairs at the other end of the building, since there were no stairs by my side. You also had to walk past a large bay window in my bedroom to get to the front door. I had a friend who was also a single mother. She had 3 kids, and we helped each other out with babysitting. I worked second shift and she worked third shift, so we would take turns watching each other's children. Since my apartment was only 2 bedrooms, I would lay blankets on the living room floor for her kids to sleep on. They were 1, 3, and 4 years old at the time. I'd put my boys to bed in their room, then get her kids to sleep. After that, I'd lock the front door and go to bed. One night, something woke me up around 1:30 a.m. I wasn't sure what it was, but I got up to check on my boys. Their room was right across from mine. They were both sound asleep. Then I checked on my friend's kids. They were asleep too. I checked the front door to make sure it was still locked, then went back to bed. About 5 minutes later, I felt like I needed to get up again. When I walked into the living room, I was shocked to see that the front door was wide open. None of the kids were awake, and I hadn't seen anyone walk past my window. I quickly checked the apartment, locked the door again, and went back to bed. That was my first strange experience in that apartment. Nothing else happened for a while, and I forgot about that night. But several months later, a friend came to stay with me for a few days. She was sleeping in my boys' room while they slept on the couch. I had been asleep for a few hours when I suddenly woke up feeling afraid. I turned my head and saw something out of the corner of my eye. When I tried to get out of bed, I felt something push me back down onto the bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe, talk, or scream. It felt like someone was sitting on my stomach, holding me down. I could hear my friend get up and open the bathroom door, and as soon as she did, the pressure lifted. I was so scared, I made her stay with me the rest of the night. About a week later, my boyfriend stayed over. We were both asleep when I woke up feeling that same horrible pressure. This time, it felt like whatever it was at the foot of my bed. The same thing happened again. I kept thinking, doesn't he hear me struggling to breathe? He woke up, saw me, and turned on the light. As soon as the light came on, the pressure lifted. He asked me, "What's wrong? Are you okay? You looked awake, but it seemed like you were having a nightmare. It looked like someone was holding you down." The same thing happened one more time when I was alone. After that, I moved out of the apartment and nothing like that has happened since. I still wonder, was it just my imagination, or was something else going on? I want to share some of the experiences I had in one of my old bedrooms. Before I start, let me give a little background about myself. I'm Cambodian, born in Thailand, and I'm 20 years old now, living in Minnesota. As a child, I could always see ghosts or spirits, but my experiences were a bit different. I believe that some people can see spirits after a near-death experience. I say this because when I was just 10 days old, my hut in Thailand caught on fire. I was burned from the neck down, and I was in the hospital for the first year of my life. After I was released, I had an asthma attack and I was back in the hospital for a while. My mom also has a story she tells. She jokingly says I'm bad luck. She says that when I was born, my bed was next to another baby who had a rare condition with an oversized head. One day, out of nowhere, his head exploded, and his blood splattered all over me. A few days later, our hut caught on fire. Luckily, I didn't have any serious scars from the burns, except for a small mole on my leg and a few scars on my hands. Most of my ghostly experiences happened in the rooms I slept in. I'm going to talk about the first room I had. I finally got my own room when I was in 7th grade. Before that, I always shared a room with my little sister and I hated it. So when I got my own room, I was excited. Nothing creepy happened during the school year, but everything changed during the summer. One night, while watching TV in my room, I started hearing scratching noises on my window. I went to check, but didn't see anything unusual, so I thought it was just the wind. But for the next few months, the scratching continued every night, and it started to really scare me. Years went by, and nothing major happened until the summer of 9th grade. I was lying in bed when I started hearing my bed creak as if someone was getting into it. I could feel my bed sinking, and I jumped up, turning on the light because I was scared. That night, I slept with the lights on. Things started to get worse over the next couple of weeks. I began hearing whispers in my ear while I was sleeping. One night, I felt my bed being pulled and then pushed hard against the wall. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night after that. Another time, in the morning, as I was getting out of bed, my bed started shaking violently. As time passed, I got used to the bed moving and the scratching on the window, but I was still scared at times. I also started waking up with strange, long scratches on my arms, stomach, and back. The scratches were straight and clean, not jagged. I didn't have pets, and my nails weren't long enough to do that. Things calmed down during my 10th grade year, but once summer came again, the creepy events returned. This was the last experience I had in that room. I was sleeping when I heard a voice whisper in my ear, "Don't open your eyes." I couldn't move and I couldn't open my eyes. The voice came again, this time louder, saying the same thing, "Don't open your eyes." I managed to crack my eyes open a little, and everything was white. I saw many hands, about 10 of them, surrounding my face. The voice came again, this time yelling, "Don't open your eyes." It was so loud and firm, like it was right in my ear. I started fighting back. I put my arm up and started swinging wildly, while the voice just kept yelling, Don't open your eyes." With all my strength, I managed to get up. Thankfully, it was morning. I looked around, and my blanket was on the floor next to the door. I was sweating all over. My clothes, pillow, and bed were soaked in sweat. I changed my clothes and went downstairs to tell my parents I was switching rooms. After I moved out of that room, things calmed down. But I thought I was done with the spirits and ghosts, only to find out they followed me to my new room. But that's a story for another time, part 2. For a while, no one slept in that room. When I went out at night to use the bathroom or go downstairs, I always felt an eerie presence from that room. I would close the door behind me, but in the morning it would always be open. I tried asking my parents and sister if they opened it, and they said no. So, I decided to lock the door and close it to see what would happen. Of course, the door was open again. After that, I gave up trying to keep it closed. Since the incident with the hands and the voice, I haven't gone into that room. My grandpa now lives there, and I guess it doesn't bother him. He's Buddhist, so he blessed the room before moving in. When I was a young girl, I was always fascinated by paranormal activities. I loved reading ghost stories and was really interested in the idea of the other side. But when I was in 4th grade, the interest turned into something more unsettling. I started having horrible dreams, and it felt like the paranormal was taking over my life. That's when I decided to stop reading about it altogether. I didn't think much about it again until recently. My boyfriend has always been obsessed with the paranormal. When we started talking, he told me about the strange things he'd heard and how he could feel when something was nearby. He shared stories about Slender Man, chupacabras, and other creatures. I never took it seriously and thought it was all just made up. One night, we were sitting in my truck after 1 a.m. Our college has a 1 a.m. curfew. We were just talking, and it was the beginning of October, so he was really excited about Halloween. For no particular reason, I turned around to glance in the back of my truck, and I thought I saw our friend sneaking into the crew cab, holding his hand up. Then, I thought maybe my boyfriend had put a fake hand there as part of his Halloween excitement. Took me a moment to realize that this wasn't the case. There was actually a hand sticking in from the back of my truck. I was absolutely terrified, but I tried to brush it off and pretend like it didn't happen. Not long after that, we decided to drive over to my house to see my pets. As we were driving into the field next to my house, I looked over and saw my dogs outside. I noticed that my dog Alex was standing next to my uncle's dog, Sarge. I casually said, "Oh, Sarge must be here," and kept driving. It didn't seem like anything strange. But when I called my mom a few days later and mentioned seeing Sarge, she said, "No, you didn't see him." I was confused. Yes, I did. He was standing right next to Alex, just like always. My mom replied, "Megan, Sarge passed away a few weeks ago. You couldn't have seen him." When I told my boyfriend about it, he said he looked in that direction but only saw Alex, not a second dog. After all of this, I started to feel uneasy. My boyfriend spent the night in my dorm room once, and he heard his name being called from my closet. A close friend of mine had a spooky experience in her room as well. Still, nothing had happened directly to me, so I thought maybe things had calmed down. Then, last night, I was lying in bed, wide awake, with a feeling that something strange was going to happen, but I didn't know what. Around 3:30 a.m., I opened my eyes and saw a dog's arm over the side of my bed, close to my chest. It was white with fuzzy, floppy ears. Its body had short fur, and it looked like it was standing on something higher than the bed, so only its head and arm were visible. The snout was long, kind of like an Italian greyhound. It looked exactly like one, except for the ears. When it noticed me looking at it, it turned its head to the side, like it was tilting its head. It didn't turn all the way, but it got to about 120 degrees. That was when I jumped, shook my head really hard, and it disappeared instantly. Lately, I've mostly been seeing dogs. My boyfriend believes that because I'm part Native American, about 1/64 th, since my great-great-great-grandmother was 50% Native American, I might have a shaman ancestor. I'm not sure if that's true, but I really want to understand why I've been seeing these things. I joined the Air Force when I was 18, and my life completely changed. I went through basic training like every other airman and then headed to Mississippi for technical training to learn my job. I turned 19 while I was there, since I stayed for over 9 months. This ghost story starts a few months into my time there, after I had moved from one room to another in a different bay. The bay had 7 rooms, and each room housed 2 airmen, so we always had roommates. But this bay was different. The 3 of us girls who were assigned there were on a special team, so there were just the 3 of us in the entire bay. Each of us got our own room. I chose the room at the very end of the hall, next to a big bay window. Across the hall, there was a room without a door, just filled with extra desks, chairs, and other furniture. One night, after going to the movies with my friends, I came back to the building and went upstairs. I opened the door to the bay and saw a figure standing at the far end, staring out the big bay window right next to my room. The figure was a beautiful girl, probably in her late teens or early 20s. She had long, brown hair, about shoulder length, and was crying. She was dressed in what looked like a nightgown. I immediately knew it was a ghost. This wasn't my first experience, and I froze. As soon as I did, the big door behind me slammed shut with a loud bang. The ghost girl turned when the door slammed and looked at me with a sad expression. Then, she slowly floated toward the room across the hall with no door. When I say floated, I mean it didn't look like she was walking. Her movements were slower, and it felt like she was in a different reality but still in the same space, really strange. Naturally, I pressed my body as flat as I could against the opposite wall, the side where my room was, and carefully slithered down the hall toward my room. Looking back, it probably would have made a good scene for a Mission Impossible movie, except I was terrified. Anyway, I finally made it to my room, still watching the room where the girl had gone. I unlocked my door behind me and ducked inside, sitting on my bed, trying to calm myself down. I ended up seeing her a lot after that, always doing the same thing. Standing by the window, crying, then going to her room. If I was alone, she would always appear. She wasn't mean or aggressive, though. In fact, I started feeling bad for her. So one day, when it was still light outside, I went into the empty room and cleaned it up. The next time I saw her, she did the usual routine, staring out the window, turning to look at me, and going to her room. But this time, she gave me a small smile. Eventually, I graduated from that school and moved to North Carolina. The building was torn down after Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. I've since moved back to the area to teach new students the same way I was taught 10 years ago. But every time I drive past the corner where my old room used to be, I still get the feeling she might be there. This story takes place when my oldest daughter, Dynasty, was about 1.5 to 2 years old. We had been living in our new house for about 6 months to a year. From the moment we moved in, we knew the house was haunted. It was always creepy being alone at night because there was a strange feeling that would come over the house, and fear would rise up in you. I could hear walking on the walls and in the attic. The attic wasn't even the kind of place you could walk around in. There were a lot of eerie things happening in the house, but one in particular scared me the most. Mike. After we'd been there for a while, I started to feel something in the hallway by the first door. It was huge, easily 6 feet tall, and about 3.5 feet wide. Think of Bluto from Popeye. Every time I walked through the hallway, I'd feel something next to me on my left, right by the door. I could feel the heat coming off of it, like when you're standing next to someone and can feel their body heat. I'd feel this intense, uncomfortable gaze on me, and sometimes I'd feel breath on my skin. I'd find myself walking around it, avoiding it. The feeling I got from it was that it was a man, somewhere between his 30s to early 50s, but the strange thing was, his age seemed to shift in an instant. This went on for months. Then I started to get a sense of his name. Kept popping into my head. Mike, Mike. Every time I passed by, I'd hear it in my mind. Eventually, I started calling him by his name. Even though he scared me, nothing truly bad ever happened, so I just called him Mike. He gave me the chills, but that was all. Mike became more active over time. He started moving around, appearing on one side of me, then the other, like he was playing some kind of game. It felt like being stuck in one of those tight tubes that hamsters run through, constantly shifting places. He would leer at me. Over time, he began to get more solid, like he could touch things. I would pass him in the hallway, and it felt like I was walking through warm jello, like an energy field, a wall of warmth. Every now and then, I'd feel tingling sensations in other parts of the house as if he was moving around. Sometimes, he would lean over me as I tried to sleep, so close that I could feel him right above my face, making it hard to sleep. It would take hours to fall asleep. Every night, I'd see a blacker-than-black shadow in the corner of my room. I didn't need to see him with my eyes to know he was there. He was a hulking figure, attractive in a way, but the energy he put off was horrible. The more scared I got, the worse he seemed to get. I'm not sure how long this went on before it got worse. One night, my husband was at work, doing a double shift until 2 in the morning, and Mike decided to really make his presence known. It started during the day. I was doing chores, playing with Dynasty, and Mike was everywhere. He wouldn't leave me alone. He even scared Dynasty. He moved one of her toys, touched my hair and my back, and Dynasty told me she saw a man in her room at night. She said she saw him in her room while we were playing too. She was scared, and she seemed off all day. Strange bangs started happening, louder than usual. It wasn't the normal ghostly noises we were used to. Mike was making his presence known. I'd hear loud pops, cabinets would open by themselves, and I'd find plates on the floor that had been on the counter. I'd hear noises coming from the bathroom, and it felt like Mike was everywhere, stretching his presence throughout the house. It was like we were trapped in a ball of Mike. I would yell at him, telling him to stop. I was shaking from fear. I'd tell Dynasty I was cold to cover it up, but she already knew about the ghosts. I was raising her to understand and deal with it. The day passed with Mike continuing to make noise, scaring us both. Bedtime came for Dynasty, and he decided to make things even worse. I managed to get Dynasty to sleep in her bed, but when I tried to get some rest in my room, Mike wouldn't leave me alone. I felt like I was being stared at, and suddenly, I started worrying about Dynasty. Mike had been so active lately, I couldn't leave her alone in her room. It felt safer to bring her into my room, so I picked her up, still asleep, and brought her into my bed. I tried reading, but I couldn't shake the hostile feeling in the room. I started to doze off, but that's when Mike started shaking the bed. Bang! Bang! The bed shook violently, like someone had just jumped onto it. I told him to stop, but he didn't. I could feel him laughing. Every time I started to fall asleep, the bed would shake again violently. Mike clearly enjoyed it. He kept waking Dynasty up, and he kept waking me up. By 1:30 a.m., I was at my breaking point. I was tired, scared, and fed up. I finally yelled, F***ck off. I was so angry, I started to push out my own energy. For the first time in 22 years, I wasn't scared anymore. I stood up to him. I ignored any further attacks from him, refusing to acknowledge him anymore. After that night, I wouldn't say his name or let myself feel scared by him. It took about a month before I felt like he was no longer in the house, though I could still feel his lingering energy. We saged the house and used Florida water, holy water, on everything. We laid down ground rules every time we thought he or any other negative spirit might be near. It took about 2 years before I felt comfortable saying his name again, but even then, I try not to say it in my house or on my property because it feels like he might still be listening. Every month, we continue to sage the house, lay salt when needed, and always make sure everything feels right. We still have ghosts in our house. We're pretty sure our home is like a hotel for spirits, with them dropping by on their journey. We know not all haunts are like Mike, but he was the worst by far. We've had a smoking man, a little girl in a white dress with a blue ribbon who liked to read in our library. We'd leave her candies until she was ready to leave. There have been so many spirits and experiences that I can't count them all. My advice for anyone dealing with this kind of thing is to lay down ground rules. Get fed up. Stop being scared and take your space back. It may take a while, but keep at it. You will win. After my mother remarried, we moved in with her husband, and that's when the strange experiences began. Almost immediately, we started noticing cold spots in the house. You'd walk through different rooms and suddenly feel a chill, even when the house was warm. There were also footsteps. Sometimes, they sounded like they were right behind you, and other times, when the house was empty, you'd hear them walking through the halls, even though no one was there. All the women in my family have psychic abilities. We're sensitive to things beyond the physical world. We have foresight, we can see spirits, and we're empathetic. It's like walking into a room and feeling as though someone has slapped a magnet to your back. You walk around and feel everything, but there's always this sharp, uncomfortable energy. And usually, it's not a good experience. My mom noticed early on that my brother and I were talking and playing with someone she couldn't see. At first, she thought it was just us being imaginative. She talked to family and friends about it, calling it cute. But things quickly escalated. We would color and set a place for Mary, as we called her. We'd even stay up past bedtime to talk to her. Eventually, it started to get worse. Things started disappearing: keys, remotes, pens, and other small objects. At first, we were blamed for it. Then, one afternoon, Kenny's, my mom's husband, pipe went missing. He was a very harsh person, and we were immediately blamed for the disappearance. An hour later, the pipe reappeared, exactly where he had left it, right after he had finished yelling at us. Then the radio turned on by itself, and the volume went all the way up, blowing out the brand new speakers that had just been set up. My brother and I were in my room at the time, so we couldn't have been responsible. That's when my mom decided to look into the history of the house. She discovered there were several spirits that had passed away there. The little girl, Mary, an old woman who was Mary's grandmother, an old sailor who had built the house, and a teenager. All of them had died in the house. I'll share more about the other spirits in future stories. After learning this, my mom started paying more attention to what was happening around us. She could see and feel things that made her uncomfortable. So, she had a priest come and bless the house. But nothing really changed. At that point, nothing had happened that felt like it was trying to hurt us. After the blessing, my mom began to see Mary around the house. Sometimes Mary was by herself, and other times, she was playing with my brother and me. As we grew older, Mary stopped visiting my brother as often, but she still appeared to me. Though, as I got older, she didn't ask to play with me as much. I still wonder why Mary chose to stay. She passed away in my brother's bedroom from asthma and pneumonia, but instead of moving on, she stayed in the house. Even after the family sold the house and her grandmother passed away, she never left. I don't need any help with this. I'm just sharing my experiences. And Mary, well, she was the first spirit I ever saw. My first truly violent experience happened in the back of the house I grew up in. I was only 12 years old when I lost my grandmother, and it sent me into a deep depression. I didn't know how to cope with the loss, so I turned to Satanism without any research. I wanted my grandmother back. I didn't care about the consequences. I just wanted everything to end, and for her to return. Only 3 weeks after my grandmother passed, I started trying to open doors and summon things from the other side. In truth, I didn't even have to try that hard. It felt like she was already there, living in the house with us. When my grandmother went home, I started looking for another way to reach the other side. I went down a dark path, researching things I had no business researching. One afternoon, I came home from school and looked around for my mom, but she wasn't home. As I walked into the hobby room, I heard something shuffling around in my mom's bedroom. I assumed it was her, so I went to check. I walked into the room but couldn't see her anywhere. I thought maybe she was under the bed, so I stepped in further to check. But when I looked, no one was there. I shrugged it off. By now, I had learned there were a lot of spirits in the house, besides just us. I turned to leave the room, but then I saw her. She was standing near the door, her face hidden by her hair. It wasn't like in the horror movies where the hair is literally pulled over the face. It was just that her head was lowered, and the room was too dark to see. I don't think the lights would have helped either. I took a step back, but she stepped with me, keeping the same distance between us. I walked around her in a circular motion, trying to get away. As I reached the door, she reached out as if to grab my arm, trying to stop me from leaving. And then, she disappeared. I ran out of the room and told my mom about it. She wasn't scared, though. She said the spirit was harmless, that she had died by suicide, and that she was just lonely. After that, I never saw her leave the master bedroom. She wouldn't go into the master bathroom, which was next door, but would stop right at the door of the bathroom. She'd stand there with her head down, dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and a button-down shirt. She terrified me. Her anger and sadness filled the room, and it was so thick that it felt like you could almost taste it. Every time I went near the room, I felt like I would either cry or scream from the overwhelming sadness. Weeks turned into months, and I continued seeing her, though I would always avoid getting too close. If my mom asked me to go into the room, I made excuses to stay away. But eventually, my mom told me to go in and get something. She gave me that look, the one that meant I had to do it or there would be consequences. So, I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk calmly toward the room. The moment I crossed the threshold, the depression turned into anger, and it felt like she was screaming at me, "How dare you!" The pressure in the room was suffocating. Then, I felt it. Something raked down my arm, like white-hot fire. I grabbed what I needed and bolted out of the room as quickly as I could. When I reached my mom, I did something I'd never done before. I looked her straight in the face and told her I wasn't going back into that room, no matter what she said. For the first time in years, she really looked at me. She said I looked ghostly pale, my eyes wide in terror. Then she saw the blood. It wasn't much, just a scratch, but it was enough. After that, I stayed away from that room for the rest of the time I lived in that house. The spirit of the teenage girl was always there, waiting for me. I wouldn't go near her, and if I ever had to go into the hobby room, I always took someone with me. That experience is one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me, and I don't mean it in a small way. It's at the very top of my list. I'm not even sure if she was human, but I know she didn't like me, or she wanted something from me that I wasn't willing to give. I eventually left Satanism on my 15th birthday, sealing off all the doors I had opened. With the help of a shamanic friend, I joined the Catholic Church for about a year and put that dark period of my life behind me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I've tried to share my experiences before, but for one strange and frustrating reason after another, it just never works. I've tried writing many times, but it seems like something or someone doesn't want me to post any of it. But right now, everything's working. My computer is on, the site loaded, and the keyboard's responding. So, here I am, hoping that this time, it will let me share something. I'll keep it short and just tell one of my more minor experiences. My kids have a play kitchen on the porch with a sink, blender, stove, and everything. For a while, they couldn't get the sink to make the sound of running water, which was one of its features. They asked me to help, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get it to work either. So we just ignored it. They had plenty of noisy toys to play with, and it seemed like things just break down over time anyway. Then, one night, weeks later, While I was sitting out on the porch trying to steal a little quiet time, I realized I wasn't alone. At least one spirit has been regularly keeping me company for a while, though I try not to talk too much about him, because every time I do, it feels like I'll be shut down again. As I acknowledged that I wasn't alone, the place sink suddenly turned on. I couldn't believe it and started laughing. The sound of running water filled the air. It was the exact sound that had been missing for so long. I couldn't help but laugh. After a few moments, I jokingly said, "Come on now, you can at least turn it off," because I wanted my quiet time back. As soon as I said that, the sink turned off. I laughed again and said, "Thank you," and enjoyed the silence for another minute before being interrupted. I don't feel like this spirit means me harm, and my kids never seem to notice him. He seems to be a bit controlling, but he doesn't scare me. I'm not sure why I find him funny instead of frightening. Maybe he's meant to protect me or my kids. Who knows? Sometimes I wonder if he's one of my children's guardians, but I don't really know. I've been tempted to get an EVP recorder to try to communicate with him, but I don't want to invite more negative spirits into the house. Seems like when one shows up, others follow. So, I just hope that he keeps watching over me and my kids. I like his company, and above all, it's a fascinating reminder that there's so much more out there than we realize. There's hope. One evening a few months ago, I had another strange experience that made me realize even more how much the spirit is involved in my life. I've heard it make clacking noises on the baby monitor, and sometimes I hear loud cries. I'd rush into the baby's room, only to find her peacefully asleep. The odd thing is, none of my other kids heard anything, and they couldn't understand why I was rushing around. It felt like the entity was playing with me, messing with my mind, and I think it's been doing this for a long time. I'm usually careful about bread. There was this awful story I read about mold getting into someone's sinuses, so I always check. One evening, my kids hadn't eaten their dinner, so I gave in and made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I pulled out 4 slices of white bread, carefully checked each slice, and everything seemed fine. When I got to the second slice, I noticed something odd. A perfectly square brown spot on the bottom left corner of the bread. It looked like it had been toasted or overcooked, but it didn't make sense. I thought it was weird, so I tore off that part and threw the slice away. I grabbed a fresh slice, checked it, and started over. But when I went to make the sandwich, I noticed the same exact brown square, in the exact same place on the second slice of bread. It was identical, as if it had magically appeared there. I ripped it off again and tossed it in the trash. I thought I was losing my mind at this point. I had already checked all the bread slices when I pulled them from the bag, and there had been nothing wrong with them. I made a new sandwich, but when I turned it over to check the other side, there it was again, the exact same brown square in the same spot. At that point, I decided to throw it away and made another slice. This time, I didn't find any strange spots, but the whole situation left me feeling unsettled. That moment really made me stop and think about the spirit's influence in my life. I can no longer deny that it's real and that it's playing with me. It's playful at times, like the night it got the dogs barking, sending my partner outside with his flashlight, only for a red light to race down the road and come up on the porch. I was standing there, thinking it was the same entity responsible for the light, and then I felt a breath in my ear. It's appeared to me in many forms. A bright light, a thick fog in the shape of a man leaning on a tree, and fast-moving red lights. I've even seen brilliant flashes that seem to wrinkle and shift in the air when it's happy. The oddest form, though, is when it takes the shape of those perfect little squares of bread. I've got more stories, but I think I've written enough for now. Thanks for reading. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to share them. I'll read them all when I can. Seems like I'm in for the long haul with this one. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm a 22-year-old woman living in Mississippi, but my heart is in Louisiana. I was raised in a Catholic Cajun family, so the belief in the paranormal was something almost everyone in my family, except my father, accepted. My mom's side of the family comes from the backwoods and swamps of Louisiana, where voodoo, magic, spirits, and demons were very much part of everyday life. As a child, I was unfortunately very aware of these things. From a young age, I could feel and see things that others couldn't. I remember telling my mom about the nice lady in the pretty flowered dress, I would see and talk to. There was also a very mean man whose face I couldn't see, but I could sense his cruelty. I often saw things out of the corner of my eye, or I would tell my mom about the strange things that happened at night or at other people's houses. She initially thought it was just bad dreams or my imagination, but eventually, she realized I was being honest and couldn't ignore it anymore. My grandmother was the most supportive of my abilities. She never made me feel like I was doing something wrong. She encouraged me to talk about what I saw and felt. Unfortunately, the more open I became to the paranormal, the more I started to understand the dangers and fear that came with it. But this story isn't about my past. It's about my present and the new home I'm living in now. The house isn't too old. It was built in the 1940s or 1950s, one of those cookie-cutter houses from that time. Only 2 families have lived here, the original owners and the couple we bought it from. They added a room to the back of the house, and that room is the source of most of my sleepless nights. My parents bought this house for my best friend and me to rent while we were students at USM Hattiesburg. It was in a great location, and the previous owners seemed nice at first. But soon after moving in, we started to realize something wasn't quite right with the older couple who had lived here. From the very beginning, I knew something was off. At first, my best friend and I slept in the living room because we didn't have any furniture. I remember seeing shadows moving unnaturally through the house, and it always seemed to come from the back room that had been added on. When my parents started working on fixing up that room, we had to tear down walls, ceilings, and floors. While doing this, we discovered something that made me feel uneasy. A pile of razor blades hidden in the closet walls, about 2.5 feet tall and a foot wide. After the demolition, things only got worse. The shadows became more active, and a heavy feeling of dread filled the house. Whatever was in that room seemed angry that we had disturbed it. A few months after we moved in, my roommate started working the night shift, which meant I was left alone in the house at night, with only my 2 dogs for company. That's when the real strange stuff started happening. I would wake up to hear footsteps or voices when no one else was around. The dogs would be staring at the door and growling, and they were usually pretty calm about spirits. They've been around them before. But this was different. One night, I heard a loud bang and crash coming from the back of the house. I grabbed something heavy just in case it was an intruder and rushed out the door, with one of my dogs following me. When I got to the back, there was nothing there. But I noticed one of the dog toys was no longer in the hallway. It had been moved to the middle of the kitchen floor, and hovering around the back room was a dark shadow. There were other incidents too. I didn't want to go back to that room alone because I was scratched and grabbed while in there. One of my friends, who's also sensitive to spirits, went into that room and was badly scratched too. Felt like there was an angry man in that room, and he was dangerous. I began to cleanse the room using sage and salt, and standing at the door to draw a line of salt to keep whatever was in there from entering the rest of the house. There were nights when I felt like whatever was crossed the line, but I just go back and draw it again. Over time, I started to feel a little more at ease. The other spirits in the house, another man who wouldn't tell us his name, and my little girl, seemed to calm down as well. Eventually, the room was fixed up by my father and uncle, and the house didn't feel as bad, though I still avoid the area. I try not to stand too close to the door to that room, especially when I'm home alone at night. Our new roommate hasn't had any bad experiences, and in my opinion, which a couple of friends agree with, the angry man didn't actually belong to the house. He must have gotten in somehow with whatever was in that room, but once the room was cleared out, there was nothing left to keep him there, so he left. I just hope he never comes back. This happened around 1982 or 1983, when I was between 20 and 22 years old. At the time, I had a group of party friends, and we'd often spend entire weekends together, turning it into a non-stop party. I was living at my parents' house, working part-time as an office clerk, and going to school full-time at the University of Southern Mississippi, which was exactly an hour's drive from home. It was very early on a weekday morning, just the first dim glimmer of light coming through the windows. I think it was a Tuesday, though that detail probably doesn't matter. I was sleeping, but then I started to hear a sound that, in my dream, I first identified as a chicken outside my window. We didn't have chickens, but that's what my mind made of the noise while I was still in a dream state. The sound kept going. Slowly, I began to wake up, still feeling groggy, and I realized that it wasn't a chicken, but I couldn't immediately figure out what the noise was. I was still half asleep, but slowly becoming aware. I was lying on my right side, and the noise seemed to be coming from next to my nightstand. I can't say how long I laid there before realizing where the sound was coming from, but I'd guess it was about 15 to 20 seconds of trying to figure it out. I finally opened my eyes, still drowsy, and saw a figure next to my nightstand, fiddling with something. My first thought was that it was my mom, who would come in daily to wake me up so I could get ready for school. But then I realized the figure was male with dirty blonde, shoulder-length hair, and I immediately thought it was one of my friends just messing around. As I started to wake up more, I realized it was a weekday, so it couldn't be one of my friends. I bolted upright in bed and yelled. The figure was hunched over my nightstand, messing with my keys and some coins I had left there. The moment I yelled, the figure snapped up straight and stared back at me, startled. We were only about 4 to 5 feet apart, and it was as solid as the desk I'm sitting at now. As I stared at it, it just faded away slowly over the course of 4 to 5 seconds, like it was disappearing right before my eyes. The entire experience, from hearing the noise in my sleep to it fading away, lasted around 25 to 35 seconds. That room had been my bedroom for years, but after that experience, I couldn't sleep in there without a light on or my dog by my side. The house had been built by my parents, so there had been no previous owners or history in the house. That experience was the second strange thing that ever happened to me there. The first was when I was about 12 or 13, and my mom and I heard a loud crash from the living room. But the encounter with the figure by my nightstand was the only visual experience I ever had. Much later, in the summer and fall of 2013, I went through a difficult divorce from an abusive, alcoholic wife. During that time, a series of strange incidents occurred while I was staying at my parents' house on weekends to work on it. I'll share those experiences in a later story, but for now, this was the first real experience that convinced me there was something more at play. This story takes place around 1985, when I was married to my first wife. At the time, my parents bought a house in a small village about 35 to 40 miles south of Jackson, Mississippi. They offered us the house to live in and work on restoring it. They said they'd either let us live there and fix it up or do the work themselves and turn it into a rental property. Since my wife and I loved old houses and enjoyed the peace of living in the country, we decided to move in after our marriage. The house was only about 15 miles from my job, so it worked out well. The house had been purchased from the surviving heirs of an old woman who had no children. This house was mentioned in my previous story, Introduction and Small Incidents. The house had partially burned down at one point, and it had been rebuilt using wood from an old hotel in a boomtown, down the road that died out when the railroad bypassed it. I believe the original house was built around 1890, though I never heard when the fire happened. When my parents bought the house, the area was economically depressed, so the house had been on the market for nearly 2 years. It was a bargain, and they got it for what would be the equivalent of the price of a used car today. The house itself wasn't in terrible shape. The structure and roof were solid, but it needed rewiring, replumbing, new drywall to cover old wallpaper on the wooden walls, fresh paint, and some repairs to the windows. We did a lot of the work ourselves, and while we took our time, we were able to finish the renovation over a couple of years. At 20-something, it wasn't so bad, but I'm not sure I'd take on such a project again now that I'm in my 50s. Soon after we moved in, people from the village started telling us about the old woman's nephew, who allegedly died in the bathroom of the house. We heard this story several times over the first few months. It was never a big deal, just a comment passed here and there. I didn't know much about the old woman's family, but I did know that one of her relatives had been a veterinarian in the town where I grew up. In my previous story, I mentioned a loud crash my mom and I heard that seemed to come from the kitchen. While writing, I remembered a couple of other strange events that happened during our time in that house, before we experienced anything more serious. We were so poor back then that we didn't even have a stove for the first few months. We had to cook everything on a grill outside. If you wanted bacon, soup, whatever, you had to cook it on the grill using pots and pans. One evening, I took a box of frozen vegetables out of the deep freezer to cook. The vegetables were from my parents' garden and were packed in wax-coated boxes. These boxes were about 6 by 10 by 2 inches, with a folded top and bottom that kept the boxes sealed. I set the box on the porch while I did some other chores, then went to start the grill. When I went back to get the box, I found it on the ground about 5 feet away from where I'd left it. The top of the box was open, and the bag of vegetables inside was missing. I never found the bag. The only possible explanation would be a prankster or a stray dog, but our neighbors were elderly with no children or pets around, and I couldn't figure out how a dog could have opened the box without tearing it. Another strange event happened one day when we heard a knock at the front door. We thought it was a visitor, but when we checked, no one was there. The weird part was that we didn't hear any footsteps on the porch, even though the door was only a few feet from our bedroom. We rushed to the door, but when we opened it, there was no one in sight. We couldn't figure out how someone could knock on the door and leave that quickly without us hearing them. Now, on to the more unusual events. In May of 1986, the ex and I prepared a nice Mother's Day meal for our 2 mothers. We made a spinach lasagna with 2 different sauces. About 3 weeks later, I went to make a regular lasagna using ground beef. I remembered I had completely emptied the tall glass pasta container when we made the Mother's Day dinner, so I figured I'd use some pieces from a box of lasagna noodles I had left in the pantry. When I went to check the pasta container, I was surprised to find it had some lasagna noodles inside. I was absolutely sure I had used every single noodle. I even remembered having to use some from another box to complete the lasagna. I thought maybe my wife had put some noodles in there, but why would she put only a few? As I opened the container, I found a small piece of paper at the bottom. It was a cutout name card, the kind used for graduations, and it had my wife's full maiden name printed on it. I had asked her a while back if she still had one of those cards, and she told me it would be in her mother's attic, buried in a box of old stuff. She'd apologized and said she wouldn't go digging through her mom's attic to find it. I showed her the name card in the pasta container, and she was as stunned as I was. She swore she hadn't touched it, and it was impossible for her to have put it there. The only logical explanation seemed to be that it was some kind of bizarre prank. But it was definitely odd. The final event occurred before we moved out in September 1987. We had a book by Peter Straub called Ghost Story, which my wife had purchased for me as a gift. She'd read it every night before bed. One night, she asked me if I had seen the book. She couldn't find it anywhere. We looked all over the house, under the bed, in the closet, everywhere, but it was gone. A week later, I walked into the bedroom and found the book lying on the floor on the other side of the bed. When I picked it up, I noticed something strange inside, an old photographic negative. I held it up to the light, and the image was of a man, maybe 30 to 40 years old, sitting in a chair holding a Falstaff beer can. The man looked remarkably like the veterinarian I had mentioned earlier. I showed my wife the negative, and she was just as shocked as I was. She had never seen the negative before, and we couldn't figure out how it ended up inside the book. None of these experiences were terrifying, but they were undeniably strange. After a while, we just accepted that the house was haunted. My ex-wife wasn't one for pranks, and while she wasn't the most honest person, these events seemed too elaborate to be her doing. Oh. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Oh. I won't be disclosing certain details in this submission, as it could make me easily identifiable to those who know me. I've lived in a region of Mississippi for the past 20 years, and I'm a lawyer, having been with the same firm for the entire time. As I've mentioned in previous posts, I grew up in a small town near Jackson. My parents built their house in 1964. My mom passed away in 1999, and in 2001, my dad remarried a lovely elderly lady from the same small town. After their marriage, my dad moved in with her, and they never spent another night in the house I grew up in. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, my dad, who was 79 at the time, was diagnosed with a terminal illness. As he got older, he became increasingly helpless, and my stepmother, who was 3 years older than my dad, couldn't care for him during the final stages. I knew that time was coming, so I arranged to take a leave of absence in the fall of 2006 when he started needing more care. I moved back into the old family house, cleaned it up, and moved my dad in to care for him. He passed away in the house later that year, and those months of taking care of him were some of the best moments of my life. It was a time I will always cherish. After his passing, I returned to my office after the New Year's holiday. In February, just 2 months after he died, I was made partner at the firm. It was a huge milestone in my career, and I expressed to friends, family, and colleagues how much I wished my dad could have seen that achievement. I knew he would have been proud. I inherited the house and the land that came with it. I started visiting it at least once a month, and during the summer every couple of weeks to mow the lawn. I spent more time there than I had since college, and I kept all the utilities on. I'll admit, a small part of me hoped for some sign from my dad, letting me know he was pleased with how I'd taken care of the house and that I'd finally made partner. Of course, I mostly hoped that he had moved on to bigger and better things, and wasn't just hanging around watching over me. Months passed, maybe even a year, and I stopped wondering if my dad would make contact. I had almost given up hope when one Friday night, I returned to the house and, as usual, checked the answering machine. Most of the messages were just political robocalls or marketing pitches. I went through them, erasing them one by one, until I got to the last message. This one was strange. It sounded garbled, like static, but I could tell it was a man's voice. The voice was so distorted, it was hard to make out the words, but it sounded like it was saying, "Wan hua really yuan, mehi pana." There were 2 other words in the background. Yeah. It didn't sound like a bad connection, though, and certainly not like a dropped call. It was like the voice was almost being muffled by static, but still coming through clear enough to make out. I'll admit, at first I wasn't sure what to think. It sounded like it could be something from one of those EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recordings, but I don't actively try to capture those. My wife and I listened to the message several times, and we both agreed that it sounded like the voice was trying to say, "Want to congratulate you on making partner." It was eerie but comforting at the same time. My wife thought it was a sign and I felt the same way, but I didn't know how to explain it. I looked up the model of the Sony answering machine, hoping to transfer the recording, but I couldn't find any way to do it. It only had the standard phone jack sockets and an AC adapter port, and I wasn't sure how to extract the message from the machine. Maybe it was just pareidolia, where the brain tries to make sense of random noise, but it still felt like something more. At the time, I wasn't sure whether it was a sign from my dad or just a weird glitch in the phone system, but I'll always remember that strange voice and the feeling it left behind. It was like my dad was still watching over me, giving me a nod of approval. This happened in the spring of 1982 or 1983, when I was between 20 and 22 years old. At the time, I was a college student at Mississippi State University. One Saturday, I left campus to drive about 25 miles to the small town where my girlfriend was visiting her parents for the weekend. It was a gorgeous spring day in Mississippi, one of those rare days when everything in the world seems heightened. The colors, sounds, and smells are vivid, almost like a Disney movie. Everything just pops. It was one of those days. I picked her up from her parents' house, and we were heading to a river party at someone's house on the Tombigbee River, a few miles away. She had a couple of bags with her and asked if we could make a stop to drop something off to one of her friends. Her friend was one of the hostesses at a pilgrimage house that day. For those unfamiliar with the term, a pilgrimage is a tradition in many southern towns, especially in Mississippi. During these events, homes that are historic, often pre-Civil War, are opened up for tours. The homeowners, assisted by local students, give tours and share the history of the homes. The hosts and hostesses often dress in period clothing, Confederate uniforms, or Southern belle gowns. My girlfriend's friend was one of the Southern belle guides that day. She directed me to the house, a large, white, 3-story home built in the mid-1800s by a wealthy cotton merchant. I parked right in front of the house, beside a sidewalk backed by a white picket fence. The sun was shining, and the day felt perfect. As we walked up to the open front door, we could hear voices and laughter coming from the back of the house. "Oh, I hear Susie back there," my girlfriend said. "I'm going to go back and see her." I told her I'd be there in a minute and stayed at the front of the house, taking in a bit of the atmosphere. The hallway inside was long and ran straight back to the back door, with rooms branching off both sides. About 10 feet from me, on the left, a staircase led up to the second floor. As I was standing there, I started to feel a strange sensation. The hair on the back of my neck began to stand up. At first, I shrugged it off, but then I noticed that the hair on my arms was also standing up, and it was growing more intense. Something felt off, but I couldn't explain why. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just being overly sensitive. But then, I felt completely paralyzed. I couldn't move. I was standing there, stock still, with my body rigid, as if I was frozen in place. The strange sensation only grew stronger. My neck muscles started to give way, and my head slowly dropped until my chin was almost resting on my chest. I was completely panicked but unable to speak. I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, it came, something I can only describe as a telepathic message of pure hatred and loathing, directed straight at me. It was so intense, so powerful, that it felt like it was coming from deep within the house. I then saw it, or rather, I mentally saw a hazy figure standing on the landing at the top of the stairs. I couldn't physically see it because my head was too far down, but I could tell it was there, watching me. The feeling of hate and loathing intensified. Then, suddenly, I had the insight that I needed to face this entity. With great effort, I pulled my head up, and my eyes locked onto the landing. The figure was a column of dark brown smoke or fog, about the size of a person. It had black streaks and specks swirling through it. As soon as I saw it clearly, the sense of hate and loathing grew even stronger, and then, in an instant, the figure swooped down the stairs, passing through me and out the front door. When it passed through me, I felt an electric shock, like being electrocuted by this surge of hateful energy. The message was clear: get out. After it passed through, I could move again. I could feel control slowly returning to my body. The back door was directly in front of me, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to turn around and go out the front door, so I stumbled forward and made my way to the back door. I opened it and walked into the backyard. The area was formal, with a garden and a stone bench about 20 feet from the house. I sat on the bench, trying to regain my composure. The entire event from entering the front door to walking out the back took less than 2 minutes, but it felt much longer. After about 30 seconds of sitting there, trying to calm down, I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise again. This time, I had a mental image of the back of the house, and I saw the swirling column in a window at the peak of the house. It was still looking at me, sending a telepathic message of hatred. Get out. It wasn't just the house, it was the property. I knew I had to confront it again. I turned around and managed to look up at the window. The column vanished the moment I locked eyes with it. I shakily stood up, walked toward the garden gate, and then made my way back to the front of the house. I opened my car door and sat in the driver's seat, still trying to process what had just happened. A few minutes later, my girlfriend came out and asked what had happened. Why hadn't I come back in to meet her friends? Why was I sitting in the car? I was still in shock. I didn't want to talk about it right then, so I lied. I told her I'd suddenly felt sick and nauseous and had come out to sit in the car. She was concerned, but I didn't want to burden her with what I had just experienced. I felt bad about lying to her, but I just couldn't explain it. We sat there for a few minutes and I said I felt better. Eventually, we went to the river party, though I was a far cry from the cheerful person I usually was. My childhood best friend had a lot of paranormal activity around him. Some of it, I believe, was unintentional, but at times he seemed to invite dark and negative energies into his space. I won't go into the majority of the things that happened to him because I wasn't always present, and I can't remember the events in the right order, but I will share one experience that happened to both of us. Took place a few years ago, late one night. My friend and I were walking around his yard. He lived on the outskirts of a forest, and there were times when you could sense, hear, or see strange things around there. On this particular night, we heard a sound that caught our attention. It was loud, almost like a gathering of some sort with someone talking into a microphone, but the words were completely garbled. It was almost like someone was speaking, but the sound was distorted, loud yet unintelligible. At first, we thought it might be coming from downtown, so we decided to walk toward that direction. But as we walked, the source of the noise kept shifting. If it had been behind us, it would suddenly sound like it was in front of us. If it seemed to be coming from the northwest, and we turned to face that direction, the sound would switch to the south. If we tried to face south, it would move again, this time to the east. To be clear, it wasn't that the noise was all around us. It was coming from one specific direction, but it would move whenever we tried to approach it. This happened multiple times before we decided to head back inside. Once we were inside the house, we couldn't hear the noise at all, even though the walls were thin, and we would have clearly heard it if we were outside right next to the trailer. When we asked his brother and sister-in-law about it, they hadn't heard a thing. That weekend, nothing else happened, but something did occur when I got home that Sunday evening. I remember sitting at my computer, reading about a completely unrelated topic, when I suddenly felt a heavy, dark energy in the far corner of my room. It wasn't just that I was creeped out. It felt like the room itself had a horrible, oppressive energy, but it was coming specifically from that corner. I couldn't explain it, I just felt it. I tried to glance over at the corner with my peripherals, but I couldn't see anything. It was pure terror, and I could barely move from my seat. I sat there for what felt like 30 minutes trying to ignore the fear, but it was overwhelming. Finally, feeling exhausted and frustrated, I stood up. I straightened my back, gathered my courage, and said, "You need to leave immediately. Leave my room, leave my home. Don't linger in this area. Never return." I was pretty shy back then, so I surprised myself with how firm I was in my words. The moment I spoke, I felt something leave the room, almost slowly, but not quite. After a minute or so, the room felt normal again. I never experienced anything like that again. A friend of mine got really intrigued by my apparent ability to provoke paranormal activity. Just being around certain places seemed to stir things up. He had gone ghost hunting in the past but hadn't experienced much, so he wanted to take me out to the local graveyard at night. After a month of asking, I finally agreed, and we headed out there that evening, joined by another friend of ours. By the time we arrived at the graveyard, it was already dark, with just a few lamp posts providing faint light. We walked mostly in the dark, since my friend didn't want to ruin the atmosphere with a flashlight. Whenever we felt a strange chill or thought we saw something, he would snap a picture. As we moved deeper into the graveyard, we both started to feel a strong sense of unease, like we were intruding. There was an overwhelming feeling of being watched, and we found ourselves wanting to turn back. We stood beneath a lamp post and shared a look as we both felt the same cold shiver run down our spines. Our third friend, who didn't seem to feel anything, looked at us in confusion as we snapped a photo of him. When we looked at the photo, his face was a deep, angry red, as though he was furious, but he wasn't angry. We were all a bit rattled, so we decided to take precautions to protect ourselves, trying to ward off whatever might be lingering there. My camera-wielding friend shivered again and started glaring over his shoulder, and I followed suit, feeling the same chill. We decided it was time to leave that side of the graveyard, but as we turned to go, the lamp post we had been standing under flickered out. We moved to the other side of the graveyard, which lay across the road. There, we found a grave that appeared to have been disturbed. Its cement casing was broken, and it seemed unnaturally aged. The air felt heavy with sadness, and I told my friend not to take any pictures near it. As we moved away, we passed beneath the boughs of an enormous tree. The darkness under its branches felt so thick and suffocating that none of us dared to walk beneath it. After leaving that part of the graveyard, we started heading back to the dormitory via the late-night gate. As we walked along the road, I began to feel like we were being followed. I turned around, and sure enough, I saw a streetlight 3 lights back flicker out, then back on. We continued walking, turning corners and crossing streets, but the same light kept flickering out and back on, always 3 lights behind us. Even after we crossed back onto base, the same light followed our path. Once back in the dorm, we went our separate ways, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I looked out my window and saw the same streetlight flicker out again. This time, it stayed out for about an hour before finally flickering back on. The next day, we met up again to go over the photos we had taken. They were unsettling. There were several spirit orbs, a photo of an old woman kneeling before a gravestone, and another of 2 men standing in a part of the graveyard where we weren't allowed to go. But the most disturbing was the photo of our friend with his face red with anger. After that, I refused to go on any more ghost hunting trips. A few months later, I had an experience that shook me. One night, while in my dorm room, I saw a man in fatigues step up to my wall locker. He just stood there for a moment, then faded into nothing. I was shaken, but it wasn't over. Curiosity got the best of us, and my friends came to my room to see if we could get the spirit's attention. We had no idea what we were doing, but we decided to try an impromptu seance. For a brief moment, my camera-wielding friend's expression changed. He looked aggressive, and in a growling tone, he said, "I have to live with—" He didn't finish, and we snapped him out of it as quickly as we could. That was the last time we ever tried anything like that. Looking back, I can honestly say we were playing with fire and got lucky. I've become much more cautious when it comes to dealing with the paranormal, and I never take these things lightly anymore. I'd like to begin by saying that while everything that happened to me took place in Mississippi, my best friend Mitch, who lives in Colorado, is at the center of this story. I'm sharing this as my own experience, so I'll refer to it as coming from Mississippi. Mitch had developed an interest in mediumship and began practicing a form of meditation where he would call on the spirits of the dead to communicate with him. He was particularly interested in receiving messages and insights from them. The first night he did this, he made sure to use protective measures, intending to only invite spirits of the highest good. The second night, however, he slipped up. Mitch forgot to make that distinction and simply invited spirits in, without the protection of only calling on those of the highest good. He told me that, at first, everything seemed normal. But soon, he started feeling a strange and overwhelming anger. He kept thinking to himself that all men are terrible and need to be taught a lesson. Mitch realized that the anger wasn't his, and it felt like an external influence. He quickly closed the session, commanded the spirits to leave, and thought that would be the end of it. But for about a week after that, Mitch and I began experiencing strange phone calls. There were several occasions when we seemed to have interrupted phone calls that we both agreed were odd and unsettling. Initially, I thought it was just a weird frequency or interference, but every time we heard something unusual, it was intelligent. It responded to what we were saying or acknowledged us in ways that couldn't be explained. I was the first one to hear it. Mitch and I were talking on the phone while I was outside. We were laughing at something when, out of nowhere, I heard a third person laughing. It sounded like a woman's laugh. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own voice, which sometimes happens, but this laugh was different. It was only heard at that exact moment and not before or after. It was clear and distinct. A few days later, Mitch and I were talking again. He was telling me something when I got distracted by my little dog. I heard Mitch say, "How do you know?" "I didn't tell you." I was confused. What are you talking about?" Mitch said, "I was telling you that I listened to affirmations while I slept, and you said, 'I know.'" I was confused again. "No, I didn't." "You didn't say 'I know'?" he asked. "No, I didn't." The odd experiences continued. A few days later, Mitch heard the voice again, this time responding with a simple yes after he asked something. It was becoming clear to both of us that there was something or someone else involved in these phone calls. The final encounter with the voice was the most unsettling. Mitch and I were talking about various gods and goddesses. He asked me something about Greco-Roman deities, and I was explaining when he interrupted, asking if I had said something about Morgana, a figure sometimes viewed as a Celtic goddess. At this point, I started to feel uncomfortable with how this spirit seemed to be watching Mitch, as though it was responding to him in ways I couldn't explain. I told Mitch to ask the angels to remove the spirit if it was malevolent or harmful. Mitch did as I suggested, and about 30 minutes later, the voice returned, but this time, it was different. It was a male voice, whispering my name, "Brandy." I asked Mitch, "Did you just whisper my name?" He said, "No, I didn't." At that point, I decided to try and banish the presence myself. I focused on clearing the energy in the room and asking for any negative spirits to leave. Mitch and I both felt the weight of the presence lift, and after that, we didn't hear anything like it over the phone again. Since then, we've both been much more cautious when dealing with spirits and the unknown. The experiences that happened in that short period of time left us both with a sense of unease, but also a deeper understanding of the potential dangers of interacting with spirits unprotected. I have several paranormal stories, but one in particular stands out as the most terrifying experience I've ever had. To set the scene, the layout of the house is important for later. When you walk in the front door, you enter the living room. If you go left, you find her bedroom, a bathroom, and her brother's room. If you go right, you enter a dining area with the kitchen off to the right and her parents' bedroom beyond that. At the end of the house, there's a small hallway leading to a door that opens into the garage. It was a small house, so I was about 15 or 16 at the time, and my best friend, Anna, and I had planned for me to stay over at her house that Friday, as usual. We'd flip-flop weekends, her house one weekend, mine the next. We stayed up late, watching movies, laughing, and just having fun. By the time we finally went to bed, we were both exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. But around 3 a.m., something started pounding on her bedroom window. Now, her headboard was right against that wall, and I was sleeping closest to the window. At first, I thought I was just dreaming because the pounding seemed to bleed into my sleep. But it was so loud and insistent, I quickly realized it wasn't a dream. I thought maybe it was just her dad, as he liked to play pranks on us, so I tried to brush it off. Still half asleep, Anna asked me, "What is that? Is it coming from the closet?" I replied, "No, someone is beating on the window." At that point, we both shot out of bed in a panic and ran into the living room. Anna immediately went to check on her parents, while I went straight for the front door. I found it locked. Then I checked the back door, also locked. Anna came back into the living room, wide-eyed, and said her dad was sound asleep and had no idea what we were talking about. The thing is, Anna's dad has sleep apnea, so he wears a mask hooked up to a machine while he sleeps. The mask helps him breathe at night, and the machine was running when Anna went to check on him. There was no way he could have gotten out of bed, gone to the window, and returned to bed that quickly, especially not with his machine still hooked up. The garage door was closed, and every door in the house was locked. The house next to them was vacant, and the nearest occupied house was over 200 yards away, so it couldn't have been anyone from nearby. We were both completely shaken. The house was small enough that it only took a few seconds to make it to her parents' room, so it wasn't like we were mistaken or misheard anything. After that night, I stayed at my house whenever I visited, and we never really talked about it much afterward. Years later, I brought it up to Anna again, just to see if her dad had ever told her if he was the one pounding on the window that night. She told me again that he hadn't, and she emphasized that there was no way he could have gotten outside and back into bed that fast. To this day, that experience remains burned into my memory, and I've never been able to shake the feeling of something else being there that night. This was my first paranormal experience, and it really shook me. I was a firm skeptic before this, convinced that once we died, it was just over. But everything changed when I was 10 years old. My family moved from Indiana to be closer to my mother's side of the family, and we ended up living about half a block away from them. I'll fast forward to the later years for brevity, but when we first moved into the house, I started picking up on a strange feeling. Things I couldn't explain, but that left me uneasy. The house itself was a single-story, 4-bedroom, 2-bath home. There was something about it that made my instincts flare up. Anytime I walked from my room to the kitchen, I had this feeling like something was behind me, and I'd get an intense urge to run. It wasn't just in the hallway. The hall bathroom made me feel sick to my stomach every time I went in there. As time went on, my family and I started hearing strange noises in the house. The house was old, built sometime in the 1960s, and we assumed it was just an animal, so my dad called an exterminator. But when the exterminator came, he told us there was nothing. No vermin, no critters, no holes or cracks for them to get through. The noises continued. After that, things escalated. Objects in the house would disappear, only to show up later in the hall bathroom, inside the sink cabinet. My parents thought we were messing with them, and tension started to build. They were usually very loving, but now they fought more over small things, it seemed. Something was changing in them. Then my little sister started hearing growling in her room at night, followed by what sounded like pacing back and forth. I started hearing knocks on my bedroom window. Not frantic knocking, but a steady, almost rhythmic, let me in knock. I thought it was just kids playing pranks. One night I was in a bad mood, though I can't remember exactly why, and, for the first time, I opened the curtains to check and see who was outside. There was no one there. It only took 2 seconds to get to my window from my bed, and I was shocked. I immediately told my parents, but they brushed it off, saying I was imagining things. Things got worse after that. My sister started waking up screaming, saying that a shadow was after her. My parents dismissed it as a normal nightmare, but it wasn't. She still has that nightmare to this day. Now, I'll skip ahead a few years. I was 16, and my parents had divorced 3 years earlier. I was lifting weights in my room around 8 p.m. when the tapping began again. Tapping on my window. It had stopped after I'd opened the curtains when I was 10. But now, there it was again. I opened the curtains, and once again, there was nothing there. By then, my sister was 11, still having the same nightmare, and we had both started experiencing something much more sinister. We began waking up with scratch marks on our skin, and at times we'd notice what looked like bite marks. 2 holes about the size of a canine's, right on our arms or legs. These weren't occasional marks. It was happening every night. I spoke to the granddaughter of the family we had bought the house from. She told me that her family hadn't experienced any paranormal activity while they lived there, but she did mention something unsettling. When her aunt was 16, she had taken her own life in the hall bathroom by drinking a large amount of rat poison mixed with juice. I turned to a friend of mine who was interested in the paranormal. He suggested I burn sage and let the smoke fill every corner of the house. I followed his advice, and for about 2 months everything seemed to stop. But I think the entity was angered by the saging because it came back stronger. 2 months after the saging, my sister started seeing the shadow again, just like in her nightmares. I also began seeing it. It was always the same, a tall, shadowy figure like an old cowboy silhouette. The figure had a wide-brimmed hat, and it wore what looked like a trench coat. Its eyes glowed a deep, blood red. To this day, both of us are still experiencing this entity. Since then, I've married and moved out, but my mother and sister are still living in that house. I've been thinking a lot about how to get rid of this entity, but I'm not sure what to do. Do they need to move? Is there a way to banish it once and for all? I don't know, but I feel like something has been attached to that place for a long time. Last spring, 2011. During our break, a friend of mine went to Arizona. When she returned a week later, she brought back gifts from out in the desert. At school, she gave me a small bag filled with stones and shells. I found them on a walk through the desert, she said. I don't know, I just thought you'd like them. As I looked through the bag, some of the items looked more like pottery than stones, so I decided to check them out. Since I'm an anthropology minor, I took them to the anthropology department for a closer look. They told me that 2 of the pieces were actually pottery, not stone, and they didn't think my friend had just found them in the desert. If she had taken them from a site, it would technically be considered pot hunting, which is illegal. Luckily, they couldn't prove where the items came from, so nothing happened. I kept the bag and brought it home. My roommate also got a bag of similar items. After we brought the bags home, things started to get strange. We began hearing voices and seeing shadowy figures in the house. My roommate started having terrifying nightmares, while I had strange dreams about a little girl. There were some nights where I had nightmares, but I would always dream about the little girl, even if the rest of the dream was unpleasant. Things would disappear in my room, only to reappear a few days later in the exact spot where I had left them. Sometimes I would find little fingerprints on things. I wasn't scared, but my roommate was really freaked out. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore and got rid of her bag of items. I decided to move mine to another room, hoping that it would stop the strange dreams and disturbances. That night, I had a vivid dream. A little girl was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest, her braids swishing as she rocked back and forth. I could hear her crying. When I walked over to her, she looked up at me and spoke in a language I couldn't understand while awake. But in the dream, I clearly heard her say, "Why did you leave me alone? It's so dark now, and I'm so lonely. I was safe with you, you kept me by where you sleep. I wasn't alone anymore." I was safe, but now it's so dark, and I'm scared. Please don't leave me alone anymore. I'm sorry. I woke up with tears in my eyes, feeling guilty, as though I could still hear her crying. I quickly got up, went into the dining room where I had left the bag, and whispered, "I'm sorry," to her. I picked up the bag and carried it back to my room, placing it back on my bedside table. As I went to bed, I heard a soft thank you and felt a small hand brush against my cheek. From then on, I would hear giggles at night and feel little things being moved around as if a mischievous child were playing. Sometimes the covers on my bed would be pulled off while I was sleeping. I'd wake up to feel something tugging at the blankets, and there were nights when I had a little tug of war with the covers as they were slowly pulled off of me. Some of my friends started noticing her too. They would see or feel her presence around the apartment. It was always clear that it wasn't a real child. No one could have gotten into my room because I always locked the door, and there were no children in our apartment. It was just the four of us college girls, and none of us had kids. When we moved into a new house, I brought the little girl with me. She seemed to like her new home, but she also warned me about the bad man, as she called him. She said he was mean and that she didn't like him. I could feel her fear whenever I held the shards of pottery in my hands. She tried to protect me from him, but he was too strong. One night, I heard her running around the house, so I let the dogs out of their room. They ran straight to where I had heard her. The next thing I knew, the dogs were making their happy noises, and I could hear giggles. When I went to check, I found the dogs alone in the living room, playing and looking up as if a child was standing right in front of them, even though there was no one there. She still likes to move things around, and since we got rid of the bad man in the back room, the little girl has been much happier. She's even made herself known to some visitors who have seen, heard, or felt her presence. I could never part with her. I've had offers from people to send her on her way, but every time I ask her, she says she doesn't want to leave because she feels safe with me. When she's ready to go, I'll let her go, but until then, she'll stay with me. She's just one of the spirits that inhabit this house, and I have more stories about the others if you'd like to hear them. The rural Deep South is a land steeped in legend, especially for those with an interest in the things that go bump in the night. The ancient woods and swamps are said to be filled with spirits from the past, lingering in the shadows. One such place is a secluded cemetery in northern Mississippi known as Old Salem. It's about 10 miles outside of town, deep in the woods, and the only road leading to it is a one-lane gravel path surrounded by thick, tangled trees. Over the years, a number of strange legends have sprung up about the cemetery, stories of shadow men darting between the graves, black masses, and demonic spirits. In the summer of 2011, a group of friends and I decided to visit Old Salem. We arrived around 3 a.m. The air was warm and still, and the sky above was filled with billions of bright stars. If it weren't for the uneasy vibe that always seemed to hang around Old Salem, it would have been the perfect, peaceful summer night. We hadn't gone far into the graveyard when we heard a sound in the distance. At first, it sounded like coyotes, but as we listened more closely, we realized it wasn't coyotes at all. It sounded like children laughing. The laughter grew louder, but what followed next made the hair on the back of our necks stand up. The sound of a woman screaming. The cries didn't seem to come from the cemetery itself, but from the surrounding woods. The dark trees seemed to echo with the unsettling sound of children's laughter and the woman's scream. With nothing but a single flashlight and our courage quickly fading, we decided it was time to leave. We hurried out of the cemetery, terrified by the noises and the strange feeling in the air. After that night, we dug deeper into the paranormal, learning as much as we could and gathering the equipment necessary for ghost hunting. Armed with video cameras, audio recorders, and EMF meters, we returned to Old Salem. This time, we were prepared for anything. We entered the cemetery again, this time more determined, making our way toward the center of the graveyard. As we approached an iron-fenced area with an obelisk that had been knocked over and dragged, our EMF meters started spiking. While we didn't see anything with our eyes, our equipment began to pick up evidence. The audio recorders captured several EVPs, most of which were difficult to make out. But one in particular stood out. A voice hissed my name. Our camera also captured something extraordinary. It filmed a hooded figure standing at a distance between some headstones, watching us as we moved about. The figure didn't move, but the camera caught something else. An arm seemed to reach out between the same headstones where the hooded figure had been standing. That investigation convinced me that Old Salem was haunted, and I was so shaken by the experience that I didn't return for quite some time. Though it's small, Old Salem is one of the hottest spots for paranormal activity in North Mississippi. The isolation of the area alone is enough to make anyone's hair stand on end. Despite how far I may travel, the eerie gates, surrounded by dark, ominous trees, always seem to pull me back. The thrill of the unknown, waiting among the dead, keeps calling me. I'm 17, and my parents kicked me out in October 2012. I now live in my own apartment with my girlfriend. This happened last December. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I was walking home from work in the rain. I stopped by Burger King to grab dinner for my girlfriend and me. As I continued walking home, I heard what sounded like a child crying coming from an alley. I went to check it out and found a little girl curled up, crying. She looked to be no older than 7 or 8 years old. Her clothes were dirty and worn, so I assumed she was homeless. I asked her, "What's wrong?" She looked up and said, "My mommy died." I felt for her, so I said, "I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" She replied, "I'll be fine." She was only wearing a shirt and shorts in the cold rain, so I took off my jacket and gave it to her. She looked so thin, so I handed her the 2 cheeseburgers and the soda I had bought for myself. I even gave her $30 from my wallet. I said, "Sorry, but I have to go now." She said, "Okay, bye and thank you." I replied, "No problem," and then went on my way. When I got home, my girlfriend, Annie, wasn't there. I put the food in the fridge and went to take a shower. Just as I was about to go into the bathroom, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, and to my surprise, it was the same little girl from the alley. I asked, "What are you doing here?" She said, "I wanted to thank you again." I smiled and said, "Why don't you come in? I'll get you something to drink." She said, "Thanks," and I gave her some milk and cookies. I told her to sit and enjoy her snack while I went to the bathroom. But when I came out, she was gone, and the milk and cookies were untouched. I looked around the apartment but didn't find her. I figured she must have left, so I went to take my shower, locking the front door behind me. While I was washing my hair, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I panicked, threw on my boxers and pants, and ran out to see who it was. But there was no one there. I checked the front door, it was still locked. I figured I was just imagining things and got back in the shower. But then, I heard a little girl giggling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. I looked at the door, it was still locked. I asked, "How did you get in here?" She didn't answer. She just giggled. Then she grabbed my towel and clothes and ran off. I quickly grabbed my boxers and chased after her. I saw her run into my room, and just as I was about to follow, Annie and her 5 friends walked in. Annie asked why I was wet and running around in my underwear. I told her about the little girl, and she laughed. I said, "Let's just get my clothes back." So the 7 of us went into my room and searched, but we didn't find anything. Then I walked into the living room, and to my surprise, my clothes were on the couch. I asked everyone if there was any way she could have slipped past us, but they all said no. I checked the door again. It was locked. None of us could figure out how she had gotten out. So I went back to finish my shower. An hour later, after everyone left, I heard giggling again. The little girl was standing in the doorway of my room. Annie asked how she got in, and the girl just smiled and ran off. Annie and I jumped out of bed and ran after her. But again, we searched the apartment and found nothing. It felt like she was playing some kind of game with us. We don't have a problem with her, but we're just curious. Why is she messing with us? Why did she choose to have fun with us? Any guesses? My experiences with spirits. A childhood to present journey. I began having strange experiences with spirits when I was about 8 years old. It happened during Christmas at my grandma's house. I had stepped into a side room to take a break from the family, and I was admiring a small ornament on the Christmas tree. That's when I saw it. A bright, white light moving across the room. I turned to see a column of pure white light stretching from the ceiling to the floor in my grandma's bedroom. It was a bit wider than a person, and it moved smoothly toward the wall that led to the kitchen. I rushed to check, but there was nothing there. I didn't fully understand what had happened, but somehow, I knew it was a spirit. Fast forward to when I was in 6th grade. I started noticing odd things happening in my house. I'd come home from school every day at about 2:40 p.m. to an empty house. But, almost right after I walked in, I would hear footsteps downstairs. A few minutes later, the toilet upstairs would flush by itself. It didn't stop there. Sometimes a wind-up toy monkey in our living room, which I hated because it always creeped me out, would suddenly start clanging its cymbals together, even though it couldn't go off unless it was wound up. The most unsettling thing, though, was hearing footsteps coming from my basement, walking up and down the stairs. I didn't know much about spirits back then, but I was terrified. I was convinced that this spirit might harm me if I angered it in some way. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. I invited 2 friends over to try and communicate with the spirit. One of my friends didn't believe in ghosts, and I wanted to prove to her that something was really going on. We managed to make contact with the spirit. She introduced herself as Janet, an 81-year-old woman who was quite sad. What struck me was that I had a feeling her name might be Janet even before we communicated with her. We asked her if she could control electricity, and to our surprise, she turned off our flashlight multiple times when we asked her to. I only saw her once, just for a second, peering out from my sister's window when I was outside during the summer. She had long, straight hair and a sorrowful expression. During the communication, we only heard her voice. Afterward, we were all both excited and a bit scared. Then something strange happened. That night, we had a fortune cookie with our takeout, and when I opened it, the fortune read, "Seek advice from an octogenarian." Janet had been 81. It felt like too much of a coincidence, and after that, my friends never came over again. Since then, some of my friends have mentioned feeling watched when they were in my basement, and others have said they've gotten a creepy feeling from it. Something both my friends had described after our communication with Janet. Later experiences. The house and grandma's farmhouse. A couple of years ago, I started feeling uneasy in a small upstairs room at my grandma's farmhouse. This farmhouse is over 80 years old, so I tried not to read too much into it. But one night, I was trying to sleep in the room, and I started hearing footsteps outside my door. I peeked out, thinking it was my dad, but no one was there. I laid back down, feeling uneasy, and soon enough, the footsteps approached my bed. They walked right beside me, but I couldn't see anyone. The most terrifying part was that I could hear the footsteps clearly, but there was nothing there. Felt like something was there, watching me. After that, I slept in another room, and the footsteps never bothered me again. When I asked my aunt about it, she confirmed that she'd also felt something strange upstairs, but she wasn't sure what it was. As for Janet, she hasn't been as active lately. However, something strange happened with a mask my sister made for art class. My mom hung it in her room, but one day we heard a loud crash. The mask had fallen off the wall, and all of the beads on it had come off. We put it back up, but it fell again in the exact same way. The mask resembled a Native American design, and the land around my grandmother's house was once home to Native American tribes. It made me wonder if Janet's spirit had something to do with it. Perhaps she had a troubled past. Since then, I've had a few more small experiences, but nothing major. Janet's presence has been less noticeable recently, and I haven't been trying to contact spirits as much. The demon that followed my mom home. This story happened when my mom was a teenager, but I was there to see how it affected her later. At the time, my mom was in the process of becoming Catholic. She saved up some money and flew to Minnesota to attend a Catholic conference. It was autumn, and the leaves were turning beautiful colors. On her first day, she decided to take a nature walk. The hotel concierge told her about a nearby wilderness preserve with walking paths, so she decided to explore. My mom is a very brave person, even in unfamiliar places. There were other people around enjoying the park, so she wasn't worried about walking alone. The walk started out nice, but as it got darker, she decided it was time to head back to her car. That's when things got strange. As she walked back, the forest around her suddenly went silent. She started feeling like someone, or something, was watching her. It wasn't just a normal feeling of being watched. It felt like she was being hunted. Feeling uneasy, she began to pray. That's when the real fear set in. She heard heavy breathing in her right ear. It sounded like a huge creature that had been running, panting hard. Along with the breathing, she could hear loud footsteps, crushing through the grass and leaves beside her. She could even see the grass moving as if something invisible was walking next to her. She tried walking faster, but whatever it was, it matched her speed. The people she had seen earlier had all left, and the walk back to her car seemed to stretch on forever. When she finally made it back to her hotel room, she was shaken and exhausted. The next morning, she set her alarm to wake up for Massachusetts. When the alarm went off, she sleepily reached over to turn it off. But as she did, she noticed something strange. There was another alarm clock in the room, one she hadn't seen before. This new clock showed a different time, and according to it, she still had an hour before she needed to get up. For some reason, she decided to trust it and went back to sleep. When she finally woke up again, the mysterious second alarm clock was gone. She had missed Mass. When my mom came back home from Minnesota, she seemed more determined than ever to live as a Catholic. But there was something different about her. She was quieter, more distant. I noticed that she spent a lot of time sitting in her chair by the window, praying her rosary with a troubled look on her face. When I asked her what was wrong, she wouldn't say much. After about a month of this, she finally opened up to me. She told me that since her experience in Minnesota, she couldn't pray properly. Every time she tried, her prayers were filled with disturbing thoughts and horrible images. It made her feel disgusted, and she became too ashamed to pray. She spoke to a priest about it, and he explained that the demon from the forest had followed her home. It was trying to stop her from praying by filling her mind with these awful visions. The priest told her that the only way to fight it was to keep praying, even through the disturbing thoughts. So that's what she did. She spent hours praying, even when it felt impossible. Eventually, the demon stopped tormenting her, and she was able to pray in peace again. The ghost who protected me. This happened when I was little, around 3 or 4 years old, and I swear on my life that it's true. When I was a child, I would see a ghost in my room, an old woman. She always stood in the corner of my room at night, and all you could see were her head and shoulders. My mom would put me to bed, and while she did, the woman would watch us and smile. After my mom left, that's when things got strange. At first, the woman just stood there and smiled at me. It wasn't a creepy smile, but a kind, gentle one, like how a mother would smile at her baby. She made me feel safe. After a while, she started talking to me. Every night, she would say the same thing. She was there to protect me. And she told me she was protecting me from demons who were after me because of something I had done in a past life. I'm not making this up. Just thinking about it still makes me shiver. But when I was little, I felt comforted by her. She made me feel calm, like nothing could hurt me. Soon, she started telling me other things too. She explained how ghosts could die too and talked about the afterlife. Here's the strange part. She said that when people become ghosts, they eventually vanish. Some disappear into a bright doorway and never return, while others, their spiritual energy, becomes part of another being, reincarnation. At the time, I didn't really understand what she meant, but she said that when I got older, I would. Then, things started to change. The woman began to act more paranoid, repeating that she was there to protect me. Around the same time, I started seeing small shadows dancing on the walls, near the top of my room. I had a nightlight so I could see them clearly. These little figures moved in circles, holding hands and dancing for hours. She told me that as I grew older, I would be able to protect myself, and when that time came, she would have to leave. She said her time was almost up. I didn't see her for a while after that, and the dancing shadows eventually disappeared. A long time later, I woke up late at night. The room was unusually bright, and when I looked around, I saw that all of my blankets were rolled up and placed around me in a circle. I was already terrified, but the scariest part came next. At the end of my bed, I saw a tall bluish-green figure reaching for me. I quickly turned to my side and kicked out my foot. When my heel touched the figure, it felt warm, like soft energy, almost like when you quickly pass your hand through fire. As soon as I kicked it, I heard a soft thud as it stepped back. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure walk toward my window and pass right through it, as if it were walking through the wall. As it passed the window, the curtains blew like there was a strong wind, even though the windows were closed. The room grew dimmer after the figure left. I gathered the courage to look around, and when I turned on the lights, I saw a footprint on the carpet. It didn't have toes, just a point where the figure's foot had stepped. The curtains were still moving, like the wind had stirred them. In the morning, my heel felt tingly, and the blankets were still rolled up. I checked the window and it was still closed and locked. The footprint was barely visible now. I wanted to tell my mom, but I knew she wouldn't believe me, and I didn't even know how to explain it. After that, I didn't see the woman or the shadow figures for a long time. A year or so later, when I was about 5, I was in my basement. Suddenly, I felt the same presence I had felt when the woman was around. I looked around and saw a nail on the wall spinning slowly, coming out of the wood. As it stopped, the shadow grew longer, and I saw her again. She had a happy expression on her face, and behind her, there was a bright white light. She said, "It's my time. My time is here." And then she vanished. I remember feeling sad, like I knew she was really leaving. Since then, I haven't experienced much ghost activity. The only other time was in 2nd grade, when I saw a pale man with a long coat and hat tap the person sitting next to me on the shoulder. She turned around and freaked out, asking who did it. Nobody else saw anything, but she said the finger that tapped her was cold. I also swear my house is haunted. All my friends have seen or heard things when it's just me and them, and it always freaks them out. Especially when we video chat, I don't see or hear anything, but they do. My dog will also perk up her ears and look around as if someone's there. I'm not making any of this up. If you choose not to believe me, that's your choice. Also, I'm adopted and don't have contact with my birth family, so I can't say if this ghost was a relative. She wasn't part of my adopted family. I've seen all the pictures, and we don't have many deceased relatives. I've tried searching the web to see if anyone has had the same experience with a blue ghost, but I couldn't find anything. I did tell my mom about the experience years later, but she didn't believe me. We're not a very religious family, but I truly believe in the supernatural. Even some of my most skeptical friends believe me after hearing what I went through. Did I create a spirit? My husband Bob and I had been married for 2 years when he left the army and we moved to his hometown in Michigan. After 8 years in the military, Bob struggled to adjust to civilian life, and things started to go downhill for us. I was homesick. I'm from Minnesota, depressed and angry at Bob because he was drinking all the time. We were always short on money, and I had to work 2 full-time jobs, sometimes even a 3rd part-time job, just to pay the bills. Meanwhile, Bob wasn't working and was spending most of our money on alcohol. The stress was unbearable, and soon, strange things began to happen in our home. It started with Bob tripping over things that weren't there. He'd stumble and fall, even when he wasn't drinking. Most of the time, these accidents happened when we were fighting. One day, he fell down the stairs, and it only got worse from there. On Easter morning in 1989, Bob was helping me clean the house. He was scrubbing the bathtub and we were arguing as usual, when suddenly I heard him scream. I rushed into the bathroom, and he was holding the back of his head, blood running down his neck. There was a huge cut on his head, but there was nothing around him that could have caused it. No object, nothing above him. We couldn't figure out what had happened. I started thinking maybe the house was haunted, especially since we had found bones under the house while replacing the foundation. But I didn't think too much about it at the time. Over the next few months, more strange things started happening, and Bob began calling me a witch. About 6 months later, we moved to an apartment in Ohio. We couldn't afford to live in the house anymore, so we found somewhere cheaper. But the strange occurrences continued. In November, I received a call from my doctor saying I might have cancer and needed more tests. After the call, I went back to bed since I worked the third shift. While I was asleep, Bob said the glass jars for flour and sugar were thrown off the shelves in the kitchen, shattering against the walls. We couldn't figure out how they had fallen. Then, a month later, I was at work at Red Lobster when my manager yelled at me and embarrassed me in front of the kitchen staff. I was angry, and about 15 minutes later, he tripped and fell flat on his face while carrying a tray of food. There were witnesses who said I was on the other side of the kitchen, but others swore they saw me trip him. Over the next 20 years, Bob and I moved multiple times. We lived in apartments in Toledo, Ohio, then a house in Delta, Ohio, and a duplex in Adrian, Michigan, before moving back to Minnesota. The strange occurrences never stopped. In 1995, we lived in a townhouse in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. One night, I was upstairs thinking about how good pizza would be for dinner, but I didn't want to go downstairs to tell Bob. About an hour later, I went downstairs and found that Bob was making pizza. When I told him that's exactly what I wanted, he told me I had already told him 30 minutes earlier when I was standing at the top of the stairs. He said he saw my legs and heard me tell him, even though I had never moved from the top of the stairs. We moved again, and things continued happening. In our most recent home, Dakota, our husky/shepherd mix, started acting terrified. One night at 2 a.m., she ran into the bedroom, jumped on the bed, and refused to look at the bedroom door, shaking violently. I said out loud, "Please stop scaring my dog. I need to sleep to go to work." A few minutes later, she calmed down and went to sleep. This happened multiple times. At this new home, we also started hearing knocks on the bedroom door early in the morning, waking up my parents. We'd hear knocking on the inside of my closet door at midnight, lasting for 30 minutes at a time, sometimes for 2 weeks straight. There were growls heard outside the bathroom door, coughing sounds like Bob's voice in the living room when he was in bed with me. We've also seen the stereo's volume knob turn up by itself. Things would disappear and reappear, and items were moved around. I often saw a shadow figure in my bedroom and bathroom, sometimes trying to scare me, but I've learned to just tell it to stop. Now I'm left wondering, did I create something with all the negativity in my life back then? Did I somehow bring a spirit or negative energy into our home, and has it followed me from place to place? It just seems strange that all these places we've lived, some old, some new, would be haunted. Our current home is only 40 years old, and we're the second owners. If it's something I created, how do I undo it? How do I make it stop? Meeting Bridget, a journey of protection and peace. The first time I met Bridget was in Minnesota, during a visit to my aunt's house. I was staying with my cousins, Tyler and Samuel, and my ex-fiancé, who was living on a cot in my cousin's room after our messy breakup. Although things were awkward between us, I tried to keep the peace because Tyler and my ex were close friends. Tyler and Josh, his friend, were really into the occult. They'd been practicing for a while, and Tyler had recently moved into an apartment near a lake. I didn't mind the place. It felt peaceful enough, and one night, after our aunt went to bed, they invited me to join them on one of their ghost hunting trips. I was intrigued and agreed to go along. That night, Tyler and Josh were excited as we headed out toward the lake. They looked serious, though, and I could sense the energy in the air. Something felt stirred up. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, strange shapes that didn't quite make sense. When I mentioned it, they seemed pleased that I had noticed. We made our way toward the water, and it wasn't long before I saw something across the lake, on a small peninsula. It was dark, covered with trees, and not a place where people typically go, especially at night. I saw a figure standing there. It looked like a person, and when they waved at me, I waved back, not thinking anything of it. But Tyler and Josh immediately scolded me for waving at things. Then something caught their attention near the tree line, but I stayed focused on the figure across the water. As I looked, I saw something move under the surface of the lake, dark and quick, like a shadow. It darted across the water, stopping on the opposite side of the peninsula where I saw two bright balls of light. They made me smile. A calm, gentle feeling washed over me. I turned to share this with Tyler and Josh, but they had stepped between me and the tree line, so I kept quiet and turned back to the lights. But when I looked again, something had changed. Standing right in front of me was what looked like a stone statue of a woman, but it wasn't there a second ago. The statue had the appearance of clay, with black lines etched into it, depicting a kindly lady in a full-length cloak covered in intricate Celtic knots. I was startled, but there was something comforting about it. The statue only stayed for a few moments, long enough for me to take in its details, and then it was gone. I didn't understand why, but I knew deep down that it was something good, something protective. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm after seeing her. I don't remember if I mentioned the statue to Tyler or Josh, but they immediately ushered me back to the apartment. They seemed eager to return to the lake, but insisted I stay behind this time. They said it was safer for me to stay inside. Back in the apartment, I sat on the couch, Samuel sleeping soundly nearby. The TV was on, but my mind kept drifting back to the statue of the lady. Suddenly, I noticed a blue light coming from the hallway, where the boys' room was. I looked up just in time to see a figure. A woman with long, straight hair, frail, and surrounded by the same soft blue light. She walked slowly down the hall, her figure wispy and almost fog-like, and stopped at the end of the hall, staring at Samuel as he slept. Although the apparition was vivid, I didn't feel fear. Instead, I felt that same calm, peaceful energy from when I had seen the statue. I spoke to her softly, saying hello and asking what she wanted. She didn't acknowledge me, but continued to watch Samuel. I told her that he was safe and that I wasn't going to wake him. When she heard that, she turned and slowly walked back down the hall into the boys' room. Tyler and Josh returned shortly after. I think I mentioned what I had seen, and Tyler told me that Samuel had a ghost friend who often appeared in their closet. A little girl, he said. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Months later, I realized that the entity I had seen was likely not what it had seemed. While Samuel saw a little girl, I saw a grown woman, an adult figure, shrouded in blue and focused on Samuel. And there was something unsettling about the energy. A few months after that, when my best friend stayed overnight, she heard something growl in the room and felt a fan get broken by an unseen force. Whatever it was, I was relieved it didn't seem to venture into the living room. But I couldn't stop thinking about the statue lady. I began researching Celtic deities and came across an artist's rendition of Brigid, or Brigid, and it was strikingly similar to the statue I had seen. I looked up more images of Brigid, and most of them matched the figure I had encountered. It dawned on me that I had seen Brigid's image while out ghost hunting with my cousins. I felt like she had been watching over me, protecting me from whatever else was lurking around. That wasn't the last time I saw her. About a year later, I tried astral projecting at my aunt's new place, a basement apartment closer to St. Paul. During one of my projections, I wandered through their dining room and kitchen, seeing strange things, but when I returned to my body, Brigid appeared again. This time, my head was resting in her lap, and she was stroking my hair gently. She looked down at me with a warm, kind smile. Her long, wavy hair was a natural red, and her skin was dotted with freckles. She wore an earth-tone dress and a cloak of green and yellow. A soft, yellow light radiated around her. I stared up at her, mesmerized, until she disappeared, but I could still feel her presence. It was as if she was watching over me, keeping me safe. I couldn't have been more overwhelmed by the warmth and care she gave me. From then on, I knew she was with me, especially during trips to Minnesota. I could always feel her presence. Calm, protective, and distinct. I've never felt her anywhere else, but I feel incredibly blessed to have encountered her at all. Whether she was a goddess, an angel, or simply a protective spirit, I will always be grateful for Brigid's presence in my life. The test in the park. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when this happened, but I believe it was during my junior year of high school. I was dating my cousin Tyler's friend, Josh, who would eventually become my fiancé, though the relationship was toxic and didn't last. Tyler and his family still lived in the apartment he'd grown up in since he was around 5 or 6. My best friend Lindsay, who was also there, and I hadn't been close until that year, so I think that's why this memory stands out. I remember there being patches of snow on the ground. It wasn't freezing, but it was cold enough for coats. There wasn't any snow in the trees, though. That's a detail I recall vividly, given what happened. Lindsay and I had gone to visit my family and cousin. She had a crush on Tyler, and I saw this as a perfect chance for everyone to have a good time. I loved seeing family and spending time with my best friend, so it felt like a win-win. Tyler had always been into the occult. I don't know how deep his interest goes these days, but back then, he wasn't afraid to explore its darker aspects. I've always had an open mind about the paranormal too, though I never dabbled in the occult myself. Lindsay, on the other hand, was very sensitive to spirits, so much so that negative presences could make her physically ill, sometimes causing her to throw up. Tyler knew about this and decided to test her sensitivity, though he didn't tell us about his plans until later. The park near Tyler's apartment was a small wooded area surrounding a tiny lake. There was a walking trail that looped around it, connecting through a bridge and a playground. It split into two forks. One led to a peaceful picnic spot overlooking the lake, and the other wound through the woods toward a gazebo. Tyler and Josh often hung out there, and Josh once claimed to have seen an apparition of his grandfather on one of the trails. That evening, the four of us decided to walk to the park. Felt peaceful at first. The playground was always empty, but the area had a calming atmosphere. As we crossed the bridge and followed the left fork to the picnic area, I felt content. The picnic table that had been there before was gone, but I didn't think much of it. We walked down a narrow path through some trees toward a shallow part of the lake, where there were usually fish and frogs. This time, though, the area felt lifeless. There were no animals, no movement. I found it strange but didn't dwell on it. After a while, I felt done with the water and headed back to the main path. The others soon followed. As we continued, I felt a sudden sense of calm and balance, almost blissful. I walked ahead of the group, ignoring the nervous tones in their voices. I couldn't imagine why they seemed uneasy. It was such a pretty place. But as we crested a small hill, the mood shifted. Lindsay began to feel nauseous, clutching her stomach. Josh became distant, stopping often to lean against trees and stare into the darkness. The serene feeling I'd had was gone, replaced by a growing unease. Strange noises came from the trees, and shadowy figures darted in the corners of our vision. The park, once familiar, now felt vast and isolating. When Josh stopped again, whispering about his grandfather, I knew we couldn't continue like this. Lindsay looked pale and unwell, and Josh seemed almost paralyzed by whatever he was experiencing. Tyler and I exchanged a worried glance. I told him to take Lindsay back to the apartment while I stayed with Josh. Tyler didn't argue. He led Lindsay away while I turned my focus to Josh. Josh wandered off the trail, holding onto a tree branch and staring into the distance. The wind picked up, and I felt a deep sense of unease. I decided to try something, pushing energy outward to disrupt whatever was causing this disturbance. As I closed my eyes to focus, everything changed. I felt myself being pulled out of my body. It wasn't like astral projection I'd experienced before. It was more forceful, like a rope yanking me toward something. I flew past snow-covered branches, though I knew the trees around us had no snow on them. As I moved, I heard a horrifying, pig-like laugh, cruel, deranged, and directed at me. The motion stopped abruptly in front of an oak tree. On one of its branches was a small, black monkey-like creature with sharp teeth and a pig's nose. It crouched defensively, but its expression was pure malice. The image burned into my mind before I was violently pulled back into my body. My eyes snapped open, and I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. My heart pounded, and I was trembling with fear, but also anger. I was frustrated with Josh for putting us in this situation and for his complete lack of awareness. Grabbing his wrist, I pulled him back toward the trail. As we climbed the hill, I glanced back and froze. At the top of the slope stood a shadowy figure of a man, next to what looked like a bench. He was facing us, watching. My blood ran cold. There were no benches in that part of the park. The figure was solid black, and I felt certain he was connected to the pig monkey I'd seen. Pushing my fear aside, I dragged Josh along until we reached the paved trail. As soon as we stepped onto the cement, Josh seemed to snap out of it. He started walking normally, smiling and talking like nothing had happened. When we reached the playground, we found Lindsay, who had thrown up near the entrance. Tyler met us and took us back to his apartment. Later, he admitted he had hoped we'd encounter something paranormal. It had been his test to see how sensitive Lindsay really was. My aunt, concerned after hearing what happened, said the park had never felt strange before. The next day, we returned during daylight to visit the gazebo. The boys showed us a picnic table there, covered in carvings, pentagrams, and other symbols. Tyler admitted he'd carved the deepest pentagram himself. To this day, Lindsay resents being tricked into the situation, and I don't blame her. The experience left a lasting impression on all of us. My aunt and cousins moved away not long after, and Josh and I broke up. Lindsay eventually got over her crush on Tyler. Life moved on, but that park? I don't think I could ever set foot there again. Since I got pregnant, I've noticed I've become more sensitive than usual. Things that wouldn't have stood out to me before now seem to catch my attention. My homes have always been active with spirits. Every house I've lived in, new or not, has had something or someone moving in with me. It's been like this my whole life, and for the most part, I don't pay much attention to the spirits around me. Most of them aren't there to harm us. They just want to exist or are leftover energies from lives they've left behind. We moved into our current home nearly 2 years ago. Before we even stepped inside, I had the house blessed and cleansed. I placed protective stones on the 4 corners of the yard and walked through the house with sage, telling anything that might have lingered from the previous owner, "This is our house now. Anything that means us harm or ill will not be tolerated." The first year was filled with the usual, lesser spirits, nothing too strange. We live near an old Indian burial ground, so I wasn't surprised. I planted small herbs as an offering to the spirits of the land, hoping to maintain peace. Things settled down for a while, but I noticed that 3 spirits had followed me to the new house. The first one is a young man. He's well-built, tall, with short hair. He doesn't speak or interact. He just watches. He doesn't seem harmful, so I've chosen to ignore him. The second is a little girl, about the same age as my own daughter. She has long, dark hair that reaches down to her waist, and she wears a shirt and pants. She often plays with my daughter like how Mary used to play with me when I was younger. She likes to talk, and sometimes I hear her giggling or talking when my little one is asleep or away. The third and newest spirit is a small toddler boy, whom I saw for the first time just a few nights ago. This is who I'm writing about today. To be honest, my sleep has been a little erratic since getting pregnant, so I tend to wake up at odd hours. 2 nights ago, I had just finished a glass of chocolate milk and checked on the kids before heading back to bed. Both of them were sound asleep. My son was gently snoring. I had just closed my eyes when I heard, "Mama, Mama." Thinking it was my little boy, I sat up and looked around, but what I saw was something smaller than him. The spirit was the size of a 3 or 3.5-year-old. I immediately realized it wasn't my son, but I didn't want to scare him, so I just stayed quiet. He turned and walked away. I laid back down, but then I heard it again, this time from my husband's side of the bed. "Mama, Mama." This time I decided to answer and see what he wanted. "What is it?" I asked. There was a long pause, and just when I thought he wasn't going to answer, I heard, "Mama, I gotta go potty. Mama, Mama, I gotta go potty, Mama." I was startled. The voice sounded so close, so I immediately sat up and looked toward the end of the bed, but no one was there. I looked at my husband's side of the bed. Nothing. I looked at the door. Still no one. I shook my husband awake and asked him to check on the kids with me. He agreed, and we went through the house, checking every room for the little boy. Both kids were still asleep. When we walked back to the bathroom, I calmly said, "Look, I have 2 children to take care of tomorrow morning. If you need to use the bathroom, it's right here. Just make sure everything is the way you found it and don't wake anyone up. If you have something to say, make yourself known. Don't sneak up on me. It's not nice. If you can't follow the house rules, then you're not welcome here. But if you can be nice, you're welcome to stay for as long as you need." We went back to bed, and after that there were no more interruptions. The next morning, I thought I might see the little boy again when the kids went to school, but he never showed up. I assumed maybe the rules scared him off. Later that morning, my husband turned to me and said, "Your little boy came back for a visit last night." I asked what he meant, and he told me this. I woke up and saw him sitting on the dumbbell, petting Obi, our poodle. It took me a minute to grab the phone, but when I looked away and then looked back, he was gone. Made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I smiled and reassured him that the boy didn't seem dangerous. He was probably just curious. Since then, we haven't heard from him again, but I have a feeling he's staying around for a little while longer. I don't mind spirits being in the house as long as they're peaceful. It's like having a house guest that you don't have to feed. But this little boy's presence is a little curious, especially since we're expecting another baby in less than 3 months. I'm curious to see what he needs, or if we're just a stop on his way home. No help is necessary, but comments are always welcome. I live in a house built in 1940 by my great-grandfather. It's been in the family ever since, with only one family ever living here after my great-grandparents passed. One cousin of mine had so many frightening experiences in the house that she left in a hurry, leaving behind many of her belongings. Another relative told me that when he lived here, he often saw the ghost of my great-grandfather. A bit of backstory. My great-grandmother, Roby, lost a child to a fire. I believe that event made her especially cautious about fire. Over the years, I've noticed a strange occurrence in the house. The old gas heaters, on multiple occasions, have been turned off. The knobs were pushed down from pilot to off. I believe this is Roby's way of protecting me, though it's hard to say for sure. But that's just the beginning of the strange happenings. One of the most common experiences in this house is the sound of something heavy being dragged down the long hallway. It always sounds like furniture being moved, and many people have heard it and asked me about it. Curious, I once asked my grandfather, who was the son of the people who built the house, "Is there any significance to someone dragging something down the hallway?" He just smiled thoughtfully and said, "Yes. Yes, there is," but wouldn't say anything more. I've heard footsteps and knocking down the hallway countless times, and many of my guests have heard heavy footsteps throughout the house, but mostly in the hallway. It seems like that hallway is the focal point of a lot of activity. I assume from my grandfather's response that it was used often over the years. But the hallway isn't where the most interesting things happen. At least 3 times now, I've come home from work to find my cat shut in a room. I was living alone at the time, so there was no one to blame. The room has French doors leading into the living room, and they're hard to open or close. There are also 2 other doors, one into the hallway and one into the kitchen. There's no way my cat could have shut and latched all of those doors by himself. More recently, I came home to find both my cats in the spare room. This room is rarely used and kept locked. I have no idea how they got in there or how the door got opened and shut again. At this point, I began to wonder if my great-grandparents had something against cats. Another strange place where activity happens is the carport. It all started one night when I had a dream about a man standing at the edge of the carport. I didn't recognize him, but in the dream I just knew it was my great-grandfather, Pawpaw Fountain. I told my mom about the dream, and she said it sounded exactly like him. She said he used to stand out there and spit tobacco in the grass. One night, I was lying on the couch when I heard a man cough on the carport. Thinking it was my boyfriend coming over to surprise me, I waited for him to come inside. After a few minutes, I assumed he was just outside smoking a cigarette and continued waiting. But then I heard the cough again. I got up, opened the door expecting to see my boyfriend, but there was no one there. Months later, my friend came over to visit. She beat me to the house, so I told her I'd be there in a few minutes. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw a large man standing beside her car, at the edge of the carport, just like in my dream. At first, I thought it was her fiancé, probably peeing in the grass by the carport since they couldn't get inside because it was locked. I looked away, trying not to notice. But when I got inside, I asked her where he was. She said, "Oh, he's at home." I was shocked, but I didn't tell her what I had seen. The next day, she told me, "I need to tell you something. Last night, when I was waiting on you, I saw a man standing beside my car. Couldn't believe it. I screamed, OMG, I saw him too. Up until then, she had been a skeptic. But after both of us saw the man at the same time, in the same spot, how could she deny it? A few nights later, I had a small gathering at the house. One of the guys went outside to pee in the yard, and when he came back, he said that even though it was dark, he saw a man in the yard. He was so shaken that he wouldn't go back out for the rest of the night. Another time, a friend of mine was staying over on the couch. He was awake, looking at his computer, when he heard footsteps. He looked up and saw a man walk from the hallway into the kitchen. The man stopped for a moment and then walked back out. My friend was still processing what he had seen when the man appeared again, walked into the kitchen, stopped as if he had forgotten something, then turned around and disappeared back into the hallway. One more time, a few friends were hanging out in the room with the 3 sets of doors. My friend Chloe and I were sitting by the glass French doors when I saw a reflection of someone walking behind us in the den. I knew nobody was behind us, but I didn't say anything at first because Chloe had already been spooked by some sounds in the house earlier. But I noticed she seemed uneasy, so I asked, "What's wrong? You saw that too, didn't you?" She admitted she had, and I could hear the concern in her voice. Despite all these strange occurrences, none of them truly frightened me. I've always felt comforted by the thought that my great-grandfather might still be around, watching over me. My great-grandmother, who passed away when I was 5, also loved me dearly, so I feel like she's still watching over me too. However, the only times I've been bothered have been in my bedroom, which was once my great-grandparents' bedroom. There have been times when I've felt the bed sink as if someone got in next to me. That always unsettles me. There are so many other little things that have happened, either to me or my friends, that I could write for days. But I think I've covered most of the significant experiences. I recently shared a story titled Lingering Great-Grandparents about my house, but I realized I didn't mention one of the strangest things that has happened to me there. One night, I was lying in bed when my television suddenly turned on. But it wasn't showing anything, just loud static like a VCR that had been left on. I wasn't too bothered at first, as I'd had issues with an older TV in another part of the house that would randomly turn on and off. But when I got up to check, I found the TV wasn't even plugged into the wall. That experience aside, what I really want to share today are some of the more heartwarming encounters I've had with spirits, both personal and those witnessed by others. When I was 10 years old, my mama, whom I was incredibly close to, passed away unexpectedly. It was sudden, and none of us had a chance to say goodbye. I was devastated, especially since it was my first experience with death, and it felt like I couldn't imagine life without her. Though I was heartbroken, I focused on making sure the people around me, especially my pawpaw, were okay. I was worried about him. After 50-plus years of marriage, I knew how hard it would be for him to cope with her passing. So, as a way of comforting him, I began writing stories for him, stories about things he loved, like birds. I wasn't sure if they helped, but I had good intentions. One day, I finished a story and decided to take it to his house. We lived just a few steps away, so I hopped on the golf cart and drove up to his place. When I got there, his truck was gone, and I realized he must be at work. So, I left the story tucked into the screen door for him to find when he got home. As I did this, I heard something inside. Footsteps. It sounded like someone wearing slippers, walking around the room. But I knew it wasn't my pawpaw because his truck was gone, and there was no one else at the house. Curious, I pressed my ear to the door. I heard the footsteps moving around the room, opening and closing each door. First the door to the back porch, then the bathroom door, the door to the kitchen, and finally the bedroom door. I followed the sound, feeling more and more uneasy. Eventually, I realized that the next door to open would be the one I was standing in front of. In a panic, I jumped on the golf cart and rushed home, scared that someone might be inside. I told my dad what happened, and he grabbed a weapon and went to check the house. He came back saying all the doors were locked. There were no broken windows and nothing seemed out of place. He also said it would have been impossible for anyone to get away quickly. It only took him 15 seconds to get there. That night, I talked to my mom about it. She suggested it might have been Mama checking up on Pawpaw, maybe even making sure he was keeping the house in order. That idea comforted me. Mama used to wear a specific bathrobe and slippers, and the footsteps I heard sounded like a small person walking. Who else would open every door and check on things? It made sense that it could have been her. Later, I remembered a dream I'd had before that experience. In the dream, I was standing in that very laundry room in my papa's house, holding Mama's hand as we floated above the floor, spinning. I was crying and told her, "I miss you, Mama. I love you." She smiled and said, "I love and miss you too, Angel." After hearing the footsteps in that room, I felt like it was Mama's way of saying goodbye. Though it didn't ease the pain of losing her, it helped me keep going. A few years later, my grandfather on my dad's side passed away suddenly. His death came as a shock to everyone, especially my grandmother and his children. He had always been the light of the family, jolly and full of humor. His passing left a huge hole in the family, and everyone struggled with the grief. In the months that followed, my grandfather visited family members in different ways to say goodbye. One experience with my dad is especially memorable. My dad and my papa had always loved to golf together, and shortly before my papa passed, my dad had bought him some new golf balls. After his death, my dad searched everywhere for those golf balls, but they were nowhere to be found. One day, my dad and I drove to my grandmother's house to drop off her mail. As we pulled into the carport, my dad noticed something in the middle of Papa's old parking spot. One of the missing golf balls. It was sitting right there in the spot where his truck would have been. There was no explanation for it. Mama was out of town, and no one had been to the house. My dad just felt in his heart that it was Papa's way of saying goodbye, letting him know he was still watching over him. Another time, my grandmother was at her kitchen sink, lost in thought and missing Papa. Suddenly, she smelled cigarette smoke, strong and unmistakable. It was so strong that she almost forgot for a moment that Papa was gone. She felt like he must have been standing right behind her, as he used to when he smoked. But he wasn't there, and nobody else had been home. There was no explanation for the smell, but my grandmother took it as another sign that Papa was sending her a message, giving her some peace. Finally, there was an experience with my uncle, Jim. He had been looking for a box of things that had belonged to Papa. He searched everywhere, but he couldn't find it. One day, after giving up the search, the box miraculously appeared, sitting in the middle of a table in his shed. He knew without a doubt that Papa had put it there. A few days later, Jim had a dream about Papa. In the dream, Papa walked up to him and walked around his motorcycle just looking at it. He didn't speak, but he kept looking at the bike. Then, Papa reached up and adjusted the side rearview mirror, moving it around a few times. Days later, while Jim was riding his motorcycle, the exact mirror broke off and flew off the bike, barely missing his head. My whole family was convinced that it was Papa's way of saying goodbye one last time. I also had an experience where I saw Papa, or at least his doppelganger. My family was camping at a reservoir, looking out over the dam. I looked to my right and saw a man who looked exactly like my grandfather. I didn't even have words. I just looked at my dad, and we both silently acknowledged it. My dad had tears in his eyes, and I knew he saw him too. I felt like I was standing in front of a stranger, but I also knew that this was Papa's way of letting me know he cared and was watching over me. I know that skeptics will try to explain away these experiences as coincidences or imagination, but for me, they're memories I'll always hold dear. These moments with my family's spirits have brought me comfort, and nobody can take that away from me. My friend Dakota and his family live in Potts Camp, Mississippi, not far from an old plantation that used to be owned by his sister-in-law's family. There's even an old, rundown slave shack just across the road. Ever since Dakota and his family moved into the trailer, strange things have been happening. At first, the experiences were minor, but over time, they've become more frequent and more intense. When Dakota and his family first moved in, he started noticing little things. Bags, cans, and beauty products would fall off their shelves for no apparent reason. First, he brushed it off as nothing. But when he was home alone, things began to get stranger. He'd hear footsteps and see shadows moving. He'd even search the rooms and the surrounding woods to see if anyone was there, but he never found anyone. One night, Dakota and his brother David heard a voice outside that sounded like it was circling the trailer. The voice seemed to be talking about the trailer, but they couldn't understand it. When they went outside to investigate, no one was there. On another occasion, Dakota was alone with his pit bull, Gigi, when the same voice was heard, this time right outside the door. Dakota, feeling frightened, grabbed his shotgun and went out on the porch. The voice turned into a whisper. Dakota shouted, "Show yourself!" Suddenly, something bolted through the weeds, but Gigi was frozen at the door, growling at nothing for the rest of the night. Over time, Dakota began experiencing more strange occurrences. On a few occasions, he heard my voice calling him, "Dakota, come here," something I often say when he's in the bath. But on those days I was at school, and Dakota was home alone. On 2 separate occasions, he left the bathroom to find a man standing in the room. The man was wearing black shoes, black pants, and a white shirt, but when Dakota looked up to get a better view, the man vanished. One evening, Dakota and I were sitting outside, enjoying the quiet. Dakota was looking at the woods, while I was watching the weeds. Then I heard him say, "Oh my God!" I asked what was wrong, and he pointed to 2 trees in front of us, saying, "I saw something walking back and forth over there. It had on a white shirt." I asked, "Who are you?" but got no reply. Dakota's dog, Padfoot, was growling from across the yard. But then, I heard a man's laugh, something I wasn't expecting. I wasn't sure what to do, so I nervously laughed back. Dakota picked up a Kaiser blade for defense and threw a rock into the woods. There was silence for a moment, but then, the footsteps started again, this time moving toward us. We both ran inside as quickly as we could, feeling like cowards, but we didn't want to risk whatever was out there. The next night, Dakota and I were again outside, this time near the top of the hill. We were talking, though I don't remember what about. What I do remember is that we suddenly heard the voice again, the same one that had been speaking through a megaphone. It sounded like it was giving a speech to an audience, though the words were broken and hard to understand. The voice would pause for a few seconds before continuing. I asked, "What are they doing?" And the voice responded, "What are they doing?" I couldn't make out the rest, but Dakota and I both heard it clearly. Feeling braver, we decided to walk past the woods and up the hill. As we reached the bridge, the voice seemed to change position. It moved from the woods near Dakota's house to the woods near the old slave shack. At that point, we turned around and quickly retreated back to the house, and the voice died out. I'm still not sure what to make of all of this. I'm not sure if the entity is friendly or malicious, or if there are multiple entities involved. I suspect there are at least 3. The voice that copied my words, the man without a head, and the voice through the megaphone. It's hard to tell if some are friendly and others are not. My mom has always told me that if a spirit can imitate your voice, it shouldn't be trusted. So, I'm a little cautious, but I also feel like some of these experiences might be more curious than harmful. I'm a woman in my 30s now, but this story starts when I was 12 years old. My mom was a single mom raising me and my 2 younger brothers. She sacrificed a lot for us, so she gave us the 3 bedrooms in our house and slept on the couch. One night, after we had all gone to bed, I remembered I needed to tell my mom something. I got out of bed and walked to the living room. I started talking to her, and she told me to turn on the light. As I reached for the light switch, I felt a hand on top of mine. It wasn't my hand bumping into something. It was a hand, warm and solid, resting gently on top of mine. I pulled my hand away, thinking my mom must have decided to turn the light on herself. But when I turned to look at her, she was still lying on the couch, not even sitting up. I figured I must have imagined it, so I turned the light on. That was just the beginning of the strange things that started happening. A few weeks later, I was homesick, and my mom had to go to work, so I was home alone. I was lying down watching TV when I started hearing clanging sounds coming from the kitchen, like dishes being moved around, along with the sound of footsteps. There was no one there. I called my aunt and waited outside until she came over. When she arrived, we checked the house, but there was no explanation. After that, I didn't hear or feel anything for a few years. When I was 15, I was hanging out with a friend in an old room at a pool hall my grandfather owned. It had a pool table and we were sitting on it in the dark, just talking. Suddenly, my friend nudged my arm and pointed to the doorway leading to the bathroom. We saw a shadow figure standing there. It was the size of a child, maybe around our age, and we could see its outline clearly. Before either of us could move, the pool balls started rolling across the table and falling into the pockets. We both ran out of the room, terrified. After that, I didn't experience anything again for a few years. At 21, I was married and had my first baby. We moved into an old family home. Every morning, my husband would leave for work at 4 a.m., and our daughter would wake up for a bottle. While feeding her and rocking her, I started smelling pipe tobacco, like the kind older men smoke. I have asthma, so the smell was overwhelming, like someone was sitting right next to me, smoking. This happened every morning. By the time our daughter turned 2, she started telling me she saw a man in her room. We wondered if it was an older family member, maybe my great-great-grandfather, who had passed away in the house years before. As the years went by, my husband and I would hear a baby crying, and things would go missing only to turn up again in places we had already checked. Our babies would get still, stare off into space, and then start laughing, as if they were seeing someone we couldn't. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to go to the bathroom. We only had one bathroom, and my husband had always slept in the room with me. But on this night, I didn't lock the door because everyone was asleep. As I was about to go in, I heard footsteps approaching the bathroom door. I called out, assuming it was my husband, "Don't open the door." The footsteps stopped right outside, so I opened the door, expecting him to be there. But there was no one. I looked around the room, and no one was there. My husband and kids were still asleep. I was a bit shaken, but I figured I had just imagined it. I went ahead and finished my bathroom break and got back in bed. That night, I heard a child's giggle again. It sounded like a little girl, and once again, my husband and I went around the house to see if anyone was up, but everyone was still in bed, asleep. It had been a few years since I'd experienced anything like this, but my daughter's experiences were just beginning. She was 11 years old when she woke me up one night, terrified. She said she had been asleep when something woke her up. She felt like something was throwing tiny rocks or something similar at her from her closet. She lay there, scared, as it kept happening. She finally ran to us, and of course we checked the room. There was nothing there. All the doors and windows were locked, and no one else was in the house. She slept on a pallet on our bedroom floor for a full week before she was brave enough to go back to her room. Since then, she still slept in her room, but she says sometimes it feels like someone sits on her bed. She has a bunk bed, and one night, she heard the sound of her school books moving on the bottom bunk. She heard the bed squeak, like someone had pushed the books over and sat down. Another time, she saw a dark figure crawling quickly across the floor toward her bed. Once again, she slept in our room for almost 2 weeks after that. I'm not sure if all of this is connected to the family spirits, or if it's something else entirely. Could it be 2 different spirits? Why was it harmless at first, but then began scaring my daughter by throwing things and crawling across the floor? One thing I've noticed is that I stopped hearing and seeing things right around the time my daughter started experiencing them. Is there a connection? I don't know, but I wish I did. I've had strange experiences with the paranormal all my life, most of them small but still unsettling. As I've told my wife before we were married, I wish this stuff didn't happen, but it does. I'll start with a few of the smaller things that have happened to me over the 54 years I've lived in Mississippi. One of the earliest unexplained events occurred when I was about 12 or 13. My mom and I were sitting in the living room, watching The Tonight Show after my dad had gone to bed. The house had been built by my parents, so there was no history to it, no previous owners. The den where we were sitting was at the opposite end of the house from the formal living room. My mom was a perfectionist, especially about that living room. She didn't like anyone spending time in there because she kept it in pristine condition, at least in her mind. Anyway, while we were sitting there, we heard a loud crash coming from the living room. We both immediately thought it was the large, heavy punch bowl sitting on the antique dining table. We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. WTF? When we opened the door and turned on the light, however, nothing was broken. There wasn't a single thing out of place. It was just gone. Later in life, more strange things would happen in that house, but that was one of the earliest moments that stuck with me. A few years later, when my first wife and I were living in a tiny four-room house in the Belhaven area of Jackson, Mississippi, we had a few more unexplained events. We were only there for about 4 months, but during that time we would often hear faint murmurs of voices, sounding like a group of people talking in the kitchen. It was always distant, like a gathering or party, but we couldn't make out any words. Whenever we'd check the kitchen or walk around the house to investigate, the voices would stop. My ex told me she'd heard that there had been an untimely death in the house in the 1960s, but I can't remember the details of the story or where she got that information. I can't say whether it was true, but the strange sounds continued as long as we lived there. That house was eventually torn down in the 1990s, and I don't know what's there now. I don't remember anything significant about it, but it certainly added to the list of unexplained experiences. After that, my ex and I moved to a small, turn-of-the-century home south of Jackson, about 40 miles away. We were restoring and renovating it while living there. The house had been burned at one point and rebuilt using wood from an old hotel in a nearby boomtown that had died out when the railroad bypassed it. I'll share a couple of the more interesting things that happened in that house in another story, but for now I'll just mention one. One evening, my ex and I were standing in the hall that ran along one side of the house. We heard a loud crash, which sounded like something heavy had fallen or broken in the kitchen at the far end of the hall. We dreaded what we'd find, thinking it was a broken window or something. But when we got there, nothing. No broken glass, no mess. Another strange thing was the smell of lilac perfume in the house. It would fill the air suddenly, often without any explanation. We figured it was just residual from when an elderly woman had lived there, but it was always a bit unnerving. In the early 80s, I was part of a band that shared a loft space in a commercial building on State Street in Jackson with a couple of other bands. There was a staircase leading up to the loft from the street, with a commercial screen printing business across the landing. The loft was one large room where everyone kept their equipment, and behind that was a small practice room. There was something odd about that loft. When we were in the practice room, or even when your back was turned in the main room, you could just tell when someone entered the loft. There was a change in the air, like the pressure had shifted. We all experienced it, but we never thought much of it. One day, my guitarist mentioned that an employee from the screen printing shop had asked him, "Have you met the ghost?" Apparently, the workers there were used to strange happenings. Machines turning on by themselves, lights flickering, and doors locking by themselves. I never experienced any of that, but I do know that one of the workers told a story about a notorious gambler who had been killed in the building in the 1940s after an affair with a married woman. I can't verify that, but it was the story we were told. The building was eventually torn down in the 1990s to make space for a parking lot. There are a lot of little things I've experienced over the years, like an ashtray flying off a windowsill or seeing my late mother's Thanksgiving menu float across the table on Thanksgiving Day, 10 years after she passed. But I'll leave those stories for another time. For now, I'll share just a couple more experiences that stand out. In the early 90s, I was at a friend's house when we noticed something strange. An object in the room seemed to move on its own. There were several other small things like that, but none as strange as this. One night, I woke up to a feeling of cold air around me and the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. I was alone in the house, but the steps continued, getting closer to my bedroom door. I called out, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. The steps continued, but when I opened the door to check, no one was there. The air was still cold, but the house was empty. Despite the strange occurrences over the years, I'm not afraid of these spirits. I've always felt a certain comfort in them, as though they were family members sticking around, watching over us. These things have been part of my life for as long as I can remember, and they're just something I've learned to accept.